Chapter 426. Yuan Hongzhou took the initiative and rose in revolt. His pitchfork emitted unrestrained murderous aura, just like a fierce black dragon. It instantly shuttled a distance of over 100 meters and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. It didn't appear like a pitchfork. Rather, it seemed like a dreadful object made up of ominous energy that was overwhelmingly sweeping over towards Yi Shiwen with endless imposing aura. Stop! Qi Fifan moved into action at this time. His long sword swept out boundless aura. The sword energy rushed over and swept down in a slash. Bang! The sword energy ferociously crashed upon that pitchfork. That pitchfork trembled violently and got nailed down to the ground. The explosion opened a huge crack in the ground. The sword energy swept across after the crack opened. Yuan Hongzhou's complexion turned somewhat ugly. He coldly looked at Qi Fifan since the man had turned out to be a very difficult opponent. A huge and chaotic war had erupted, but Qi Fifan had a relatively higher degree of self-control among these four people. So, he hadn't gone all out from the get-set-go mark. However, this move was enough to prove that Qi Fifan wasn't an ordinary person. Yuan Hongzhou had underestimated a world hero. Qi Fifan could very well be regarded as the top powerhouse in the younger generation. However, he didn't wish to give up because of one man alone. So, he shouted, "This man is stopping us. Will you guys keep staring blankly at this? Let's get together and do it." Pan Yongbo and young Master Feng rushed towards Qi Fifan to kill him as soon as they heard this. They had realized that they must eradicate Qi Fifan first in order to kill Yi Shiwen since he was blocking their way. Otherwise, they couldn't even think of getting near Yi Shiwen. The spiritual seal fell down towards Qi Fifan. It had the power to overturn the sky and trample the ocean. Clang! A longsword attack was unleashed, and the released sword energy filled the entire sky. Rumble! The spiritual seal was cut into two halves. However, Pan Yongbo had brandished a thunderblade at the same time. He rushed towards Qi Fifan like a thunder god. Qi Fifan's complexion was calm. He hadn't fallen into a disadvantageous position even while facing the joint attacks of three experts. His sword skill was at its best, and was giving him an all-round protection. Even a drop of water couldn't approach him, let alone these people. Yi Shiwen was emotionally moved by this. Qi Fifan didn't have to take such a risk for him, but he still did, and that too on his own accord. This man genuinely deserved deep respect. However, Yi Shiwen also knew that he must focus on the task at hand right now. The problem would be solved if he could make the breakthrough in time. Then, he wouldn't have to be wary of these people. Right now, Yi Shiwen luck was both good and bad. The enlightening mind ancient tree had chosen him its master. However, he had also come across a big crisis because of it. So, even making an escape wouldn't be enough after this isolated matter had been resolved. A group of sage experts, and even great sage experts would come looking for him once they found out that the enlightening mind ancient tree had fallen into his hands. Guys, he's being constrained at this moment. So, let's take the advantage of this opportunity to plunder the enlightening mind ancient tree. One of those over 100 experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm shouted. And it seemed as if the others had been woken up by this idea of taking advantage of the fight between these four ferocious experts. So, they rushed towards the enlightening mind ancient tree to grab it since it wouldn't be a good thing for them if it fell into the hands of those four individuals. That expert was the first one to react. He also ran faster than the others. And he arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in a flash. His long blade slashed down, and it seemed as if it would cut the entire world open. The space was split open wherever the blade went. And endless astral winds swept out. It possessed endless might. These people were also the peak experts of the semi-sage realm even though they weren't a match of those other four individuals. So, they still couldn't be underestimated. This belongs to me, that expert laughed out loud since he realized that Yi Shiwen was unable to move. He could grab the enlightening mind ancient tree, right away, and then he would escape far away. Who could chase him then? Even the Heaven's Pride level experts would then become mediocre before him, at least in his personal opinion. Bang! An endless blood ocean suddenly swept towards that expert to shroud him. His blade energy was blocked off and repelled outward. A bloody figure had appeared at Yi Shiwen's side to protect him. Young Master Feng's eyes opened wide as he saw this bloody figure. This bloody figure and Yi Shiwen had collaborated to thrash him pretty badly the last time they had met. So, he had been left with no choice but to run away in panic at that juncture. In fact, the last 3 of his subordinated had to be executed after that incident. However, he was engaged in a fight with a top expert. How he could relax even a bit. Chief Fifan got an opportunity because of this momentary distraction on young Master Feng's part and broke his Wind Spirit hand seal. Then he found an opening and suddenly arrived in front of young Master Feng and kicked him. Bang! Young Master Feng was sent flying by Chief Fifan's kick. Several bones in his body had been broken by the kick. The pressure was greatly reduced from Chief Fifan after young Master Feng was temporarily kicked out of the fray. These individuals had been fighting a fierce battle until now, but the bravest among them had suddenly obtained the winning position. Moreover, the blood slave had suddenly appeared on the other side and had stopped that expert. The blood slave had reached the peak of the semi-sage realm in this over a year's time. Moreover, it had condensed 999 Tao principles. So, it wasn't one bit inferior to Yi Shiwen from the time the latter had sat for breakthrough. This was the real reason why Yi Shiwen had dared to undergo such a deep closed-door training in such a dangerous place. There wasn't much difference between him and that blood slave. Moreover, the blood slave seemed in a hurry. Its master's consciousness had submerged completely in the process of condensing the 1000th Tao principle. Therefore, blood slave's hands transformed into a pair of dragon claws. And it crushed that approaching blade energy. That expert was flying in the air, and his imposing aura was surging and boiling. He certainly wasn't an ordinary person. That expert unleashed the world-shaking blade energy once again. And dozens of feet-long blade energy swept down towards Yi Shiwen. The blood slave couldn't avoid this attack since Yi Shiwen was sitting like a statue behind him. So, it moved forward treading on endless waves of blood and welcomed the incoming attack. Everyone guessed that the battle between that expert and the blood slave had arrived at its conclusion. Suddenly, a blood light swept out in a flash. A blood sword emerged out from the endless blood waves, and cut that expert in half without any delay. Then the blood slave came to a halt. It was still riding above the blood waves. It seemed as if it was standing above all, and was looking disdainfully at the entire world from the corner of its eyes. It coldly stared at those people and rushed towards them. Its gaze appeared as electrifying as 2 streaks of red lightning. Its facial features weren't clearly visible. However, its energy covered the entire surroundings. Chief Fifan had become anxious when he had seen that Yi Shiwen might get killed. However, he relaxed after he saw that Yi Shiwen had a backup plan for his protection. Chief Fifan realized that Yi Shiwen had taken genuine precautions, wasn't akin to a lost fellow. Chief Fifan couldn't clearly see the blood man, but this blood man's energy core was enough to indicate that it wasn't inferior to him. In fact, it was also a peak expert. More than 100 people had rushed towards Yi Shiwen. But they had been scared away by the blood slave's severe attack. However, they were more than 100 individuals in number. And each of them was an elite from a particular region. So, how could they be scared away so easily? The murderous auras of more than 100 people swept across the sky. Yi Shiwen's motionless body also began to emit a heaven-shaking aura. It gradually expanded and became stronger, little by little. Everyone's complexions changed as they saw this. They could feel that Yi Shiwen was trying to make a breakthrough. They didn't know what kind of breakthrough it was, and to which level it would take the practitioner. However, everyone knew that they mustn't allow him to make the breakthrough, especially those people who held grudge against him. Everyone knew that they would come across a huge disaster if he came out powered up after he had made the breakthrough. Kill! Those experts bellowed and rushed towards Yi Shiwen. They launched their strongest attacks on the blood slave. The blood slave also counterattacked. The dreadful blood waves condensed into a huge seal, inverting ocean seal. It appeared like an unrestrained sea that would crush anything in its way. It swept down, and ferociously collided with the attacks of those experts. This was the second type of the overturning the heavens seal, the inverting ocean seal. Yi Shiwen had strived to improve his martial arts techniques in the past more than a year's time. The Hanshan seal had progressed to become overturning the heavens seal. So, the power of inverting ocean seal had also increased several times. It might be an extremely strange and extraordinary technique for other people. However, it was just a terrifying and truly disastrous technique for Yi Shiwen. It exploded in the sky. Then, the terrifying power pressed down and shattered a vast chunk of space. The terrifying energy waves spread across the world. The blood slave unleashed a terrifying power, which then transformed into a blood pond. Those several experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm launched attacks with the entirety of their strength. It carried a terrifying power. The blood slave couldn't block such a large-scale attack, and got exploded into fragments in the end. However, those experts also had half of their bodies exploded into fragments by the blood slave's inverting ocean seal. They screamed endlessly. However, these experts hadn't even begun to feel happy when they suddenly saw that the blood slave had regenerated little by little. Everyone stared blankly in shock. Such an attack had made them harbor a sense of despair. This battle continued without any result. The blood slave wasn't a match for all of them together. However, they couldn't kill the blood slave either. How would they be able to go past him if they continued to fight like this? Everyone, let's keep attacking him together. I don't think that this thing can continue to regenerate at this rate. An expert shouted at this time. Even other experts thought that this man was right. How could this blood slave continue to regenerate again and again? It certainly had its limit. And they would have to break that limit to break through and go past. Everyone was engaged in a bloody battle. Qi Fifan and those 3 experts were fighting in one group. And those 100 or so experts were fighting with the blood slave in another group. The battlefield situation had become exceptionally intense in the war between the two sides. The consequence would be extremely serious if Qi Fifan and the blood slave could drag this battle until Yi Shiwen was done with his breakthrough. On the contrary, the result would be completely different if these experts managed to kill Yi Shiwen before he could make the breakthrough. A violent collision occurred between the two sides. Chapter 427. Chapter 427, Dies in One Slap. What are we waiting for? Let's hurry up and kill him. Then we can take this enlightening mind ancient tree. Kill him. The battle cries echoed in Yi Shiwen's ears. The blood slave was bombarded and sent flying again and again. It had been pushed closer to the position where Yi Shiwen was sitting motionless. The blood slave had already killed more than 30 experts of those over 100 experts. However, it still couldn't stop the advancing footsteps of the remaining experts. In fact, their longing for the enlightening mind ancient tree had increased with the increase in the casualties. Qi Fifan had also gradually been forced into a disadvantageous position by those 3 experts. He possessed a more tyrannical strength than any of these 3 individuals. However, he wasn't strong enough to face them at once, and felt helpless in this situation. Those 3 individuals were in an extreme hurry to grab the enlightening mind ancient tree. Their sense of urgency wasn't one bit inferior to that of those other experts. After all, these 3 were already ranked as Heaven's Pride level experts. So, they obviously wanted to advance even further. And they could accomplish everything if they could get a hold of this enlightening mind ancient tree. However, young Master Feng was the weak link among these 3 people. He only possessed 900 Tao principles. And Qi Fifan had already identified this weakness. In fact, he had even grabbed the opportunity to catch him off guard, and had then beaten him. This had made young Master Feng exceptionally depressed. He had arrived here as a lofty personality. However, many people present here were more powerful and ferocious than his own self. He had always thought very highly of himself. However, he had ended up being considered as a weak link. How could he accept that? We won't bother you if you let us go. We can even give you a portion of the sprout of that enlightening mind ancient tree after we have obtained it. Pang Yongbo became even more anxious as he saw Yi Shiwen's aura was getting more and more tyrannical. He didn't want to give away the sprout to anyone in the beginning since he felt that it belonged to him. So, he couldn't allow others to even touch it. Young Master Feng, who was standing beside him, had become even more anxious. The two of them had suffered defeat at the hands of Yi Shiwen in the past. So, they knew how dreadful Yi Shiwen was. Moreover, his aura was gradually becoming stronger. Therefore, they knew that they couldn't delay any further. Qi Fifan sneered. He didn't reply. However, the long sword in his hand started to dance as if it were a dragon. He ignored Pang Yongbo's proposition and persisted in causing delay. Yi Shiwen might wake up very soon. And he could feel that Yi Shiwen's aura was expanding at the moment. It had become exceptionally terrifying. In fact, it was just marginally different from the one a person exudes when they enter the Sage Realm. However, it still didn't give the feeling of Sage Realm. The sword moves the 9 states. Qi Fifan sneered. And his long sword swept down. It emitted golden divine beams, and these seemingly incredible beams scattered in all directions. The sword attack went towards young Master Feng, who was currently the weakest among these 3 individuals. Young Master Feng retreated several steps. In fact, he had nearly been split into 2 halves by that sword light. His complexion turned exceptionally ugly. An arrogant guy like him had been targeted as the weakest one. Moreover, he knew that he would have no way to defend himself if the opposite party launched another attack on him. He was the weakest among those 4 individuals. In fact, Qi Fifan wouldn't have required several sword attacks to kill him if he wasn't being supported by the other 2 individuals. He would have been chopped into 2 halves a long time ago. Moreover, he would have died a very violent death. This realization had made him exceptionally depressed. However, he couldn't do anything about it. Bang! Pang Yongbo took advantage of this opportunity and swept out thunder and lightning. It struck Qi Fifan, and he began to stagger. His legs had nearly been broken by the tremendous force. Young Master Feng was slightly weaker, but the other 3 individuals were almost equally strong. Therefore, they had to be careful. The others could grab the opportunity if any one of them was found off guard. Bang! The blood slave dispersed under the attacks once again. It transformed into a large mass of blood and scattered. And everyone jumped in joy as they saw that the obstruction in front of Yi Shiwen had finally disappeared. So, several experts promptly rushed towards Yi Shiwen in order to kill him. They could tell that the blood slave was being controlled by Yi Shiwen. So, the blood slave would automatically disperse and wouldn't come back if they could kill Yi Shiwen. Whoosh! A loud metal clanging sound echoed. Several people had launched their attacks at once. However, these attacks couldn't strike Yi Shiwen's body. A scarlet barrier had appeared in front of Yi Shiwen. A plain-looking mirror had begun to rotate over Yi Shiwen's head in order to protect him. The experts had gone all out and had unleashed terrifying force. So, several of the experts had their hands broken by the rebound. Everyone was dumbstruck. They were sent in shock as soon as they saw the heavenly source mirror hover above Yi Shiwen's head. This was a sage tool. So, how could they beat it? They had never possessed a sage tool, but they had seen one before. So, they knew that this sage tool was dreadful as soon as they saw it. In fact, most of the sage experts didn't possess a sage tool to protect their bodies. But Yi Shiwen had a sage tool. This had left them to feel conflicted and aggravated. Bang! Qi Fifan couldn't resist the joint attacks of these 3 individuals anymore. And Yuan Hongzhou's attack rumbled on his body, and he went flying upside down. The might of the joint attacks of these 3 individuals was too terrifying. However, nobody paid attention to Qi Fifan. Pang Yongbo and the other 2 immediately rushed towards Yi Shiwen with large strides. They went straight for kill, especially young Master Feng. In fact, he had displayed an astonishing agility skill. So, his speed surpassed the speed of the other 2, and he managed to arrive near Yi Shiwen almost instantly. The Wind Spirit Hand seal appeared in his hand. He needed to interrupt Yi Shiwen's breakthrough. And he needed to take the advantage of the situation to kill Yi Shiwen only that could eliminate the hatred from his heart. Nobody in the younger generation had ever forced him into such a distressed state, except this man in front of him. But the bitterness in his heart would vanish if he could kill this man. Bang! The wind spirit hand's seal crashed down. It ferociously pounded on the heavenly source mirror and set off violent energy waves. It seemed as if a huge stone had dropped into the water. Young Master Feng had already arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to kill him. And he just wanted to kill him, no matter whether Yi Shiwen possessed a sage tool or not. Bang! An invincible and imposing aura burst out of Yi Shiwen's body. His golden divinities formed a divine ocean and began to surge about. Unrestrained waves of divinities blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they advanced towards young Master Feng to engulf him. Young Master Feng was greatly startled. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen could use so many methods even when he was undergoing closed-door training. He had even arrived in front of Yi Shiwen and was about to kill him, but Yi Shiwen still possessed such a means. However, that was only for a while. Young Master Feng moved left and right inside the golden divine waves in order to escape. He exerted the entirety of his strength. However, he was surprised when he saw a big golden hand coming out of the curtain of those divine waves. The big hand tore open the curtain of golden waves and slapped towards young Master Feng. Bang! Young Master Feng was sent flying by the slap. In fact, the tremendous power of that slap had nearly beheaded him. Everyone was sent spiraling into a huge shock as they stared blankly at this scene. What kind of power was this? They obviously knew that young Master Feng was strong. In fact, he was only marginally inferior to Pang Yongbo and the other two. Basically, his fighting strength could be considered at the peak. However, that big hand had effortlessly slapped him, and he was sent flying. Just how formidable was the wielder of that big hand? A figure came out of that torn golden divine curtain. It was treading on the rainbow light. Could this be the Yi Shiwen who was undergoing the closed-door training a moment ago? Everyone looked on, and noticed that Yi Shiwen's divine aura appeared restrained, like that of an ordinary person. His aura had become smooth and riche. It seemed as if it had returned to its original form. Yi Shiwen's cold eyes stared at everyone. His killing intention was overflowing. Everyone was terrified to see his transformation. However, only he knew that he had finally made the breakthrough to the limit of 1,000 Tao principles. World-shaking sounds had been issued during his previous breakthroughs. However, this breakthrough was noiseless, similar to the manner in which the spring rain moistens an object. There wasn't any noise. It wasn't a noisy breakthrough with brute force. It was merely a logical breakthrough. He could still feel the change though. He had just condensed one more principle this time. However, his power had become 10 times stronger than what it used to be at the time when he possessed 999 Tao principles. He had just condensed just one more principle, but all the matrix formations within his body had been perfected. The circulation of real elemental energy had also smoothened up. So, he could blow his own past self to pieces with just a punch with this present strength. He had changed innately. In fact, he could vaguely feel that he was at the doorstep of the Sage Realm. An average person might feel the Sage Realm existence after they had condensed 500 Tao principles. The more Tao principle one could accommodate in one's body, the later they felt the presence of Sage Realm. However, Yi Shiwen had finally been able to touch it. His realm was still some distance away from the Sage Realm. However, his strength had been able to touch a thin film near it. However, this thin film was still as solid as an iron wall. Yi Shiwen had tried to break it, but it simply didn't break open. Young Master Feng had gone flying upside down. However, Yi Shiwen didn't let him go. He took a step forward and appeared in front of young Master Feng the very next instant. In fact, he had moved so fast that no one saw it happen. "No, you can't kill me." Young Master Feng shivered. He shouted in fear. He was genuinely very afraid in this moment. He had hated Yi Shiwen to the extremely. He knew that Yi Shiwen was quite ferocious. However, he hadn't been very afraid of him. That was because Yi Shiwen had collaborated with the Blood Slave back then. And they could kill him if they had worked together. However, he wasn't afraid if it was only Yi Shiwen alone. However, This attack had made him realize that he was mistaken. Yi Shiwen was insanely strong. Most of the bones inside young Master Feng's body had been shattered by a causal slap. In fact, more than half of his body had become paralyzed. This Yi Shiwen had surprisingly become like a peerless god-killer after he had made a breakthrough. However, it was already too late for young Master Feng this time. Yi Shiwen didn't hold back. A palm fell down from the sky. It transformed into a very big golden hand and pressed down. Bang! Young Master Feng was slapped into the ground by Yi Shiwen. His entire bones, internal organs as well as his soul, got crushed. Chapter 428. Chapter 428, Kills Heaven's Pride Expert. Just one slap had killed an expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm. Nobody would have believed this if it hadn't happened before their eyes. Therefore, everyone stared blankly in shock when this scene unfolded in front of them. Everyone was terrified. In fact, they got goosebumps. They felt as if they had seen the incarnation of an exceptionally fierce beast. There had been no fierce struggle between the two experts. A mere slap had seriously injured him in the beginning, and the second slap had killed him on the spot. Such fighting strength could genuinely scare a person to death. Out of those four powerhouses, young Master Feng had already been slapped to death. Now it was time for another. Yi Shiwen's cold eyes swept across the crowd, like a blade or a sword. And it seemed as if his piercing gaze could see through everyone's mind. You finally made the breakthrough? Qi Fifan felt his hair stand on end as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. He didn't know how Yi Shiwen had managed to become so tyrannical. However, he was feeling very joyful for some reason. Yi Shiwen had finally made the breakthrough. So, his struggle to protect Yi Shiwen hadn't gone in vain. Yi Shiwen hadn't let him down at the most crucial time. He had finally made the breakthrough and had come out successful. Brother Qi, are you all right? Thank you so much for helping me this time. The consequences could have been horrible if you hadn't stepped in. Yi Shiwen said. I'm okay, just sustained some bruises, that's all. Qi Fifan shook his head and replied with a laugh. A bright smile had appeared on his face. And it seemed as if he didn't care about his injuries anymore. Pang Yangbo and the other two individuals had been in a hurry to kill Yi Shiwen. He had been sent flying by their attacks, but the attacks hadn't hurt him in a serious manner because of this. Everyone listen, he's indeed a ferocious man. However, he's alone. He can't kill all of us. An expert spoke up since he was still unwilling to give up. These people just didn't wish to give up on the enlightening mind ancient tree. Yi Shiwen had displayed strong strength. However, they believed that he couldn't kill all of them on his own. That blood slave had also displayed very strong strength in the recent entanglement. However, it was still blown away many times over by these people. So, a real person would have already died if they were in its place. That expert had exclaimed openly, but nobody wanted to go first. They believed that he couldn't kill all of them on his own, in spite of being incredibly powerful. In fact, they weren't even afraid of sparking a bloodbath as long as they could kill him. However, the person who took the lead was sure to get annihilated. And these people weren't foolish. So, they wouldn't wish to sacrifice themselves for the success of others. However, Yi Shiwen's imposing aura was becoming smoother and richer with the passage of time. And Yi Shiwen was unceasingly consolidating his inner realm while everyone was merely watching him. He was taking advantage of everyone's hesitation. And thanks to that, he was becoming more and more ferocious. Everyone was very anxious at present. So, they weren't launching any attacks on him. However, it would be too late if he managed to consolidate his inner realm. Pang Yangbo's killing intention was seething the most among these people. Many people had rushed towards the enlightening mind ancient tree a moment ago. The sprout of the tree was behind Yi Shiwen. But he had rushed towards Yi Shiwen instead. Yi Shiwen had tidied him up quite miserably in the past. And that had left an indelible mark on his heart. Pang Yangbo brandished his thunderblade. Nobody around him dared to approach him. Then a boundless ocean of lightning rushed towards Yi Shiwen as his dreadful, killing intention overflowed in the sky. Then, Pang Yongbo immediately summoned the phantom of the thunder god without any hesitation. It ripped open the sky and rushed down towards Yi Shiwen with a thunder blade in his hand. The enlightening mind ancient tree's entire body had started to shiver behind Yi Shiwen. These peak experts of the younger generation had collectively launched an attack a moment ago. So, their dreadful, imposing auras were still overflowing in the sky. A timid person would have been frightened to death by now. The thunder god's thunder blade tore the sky open. And it arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in order to kill him in the blink of an eye. Humph! Yi Shiwen snorted. This sound of his snort wasn't too loud or anything, but it maliciously knocked against everyone's chest like a sonic blast. Yi Shiwen soared up and flew straight to the edge of the horizon. His formidable aura blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept all across. He had released this imposing aura for the first time after having made the breakthrough to the 1000th Tao principle. And he had unleashed it completely in this first time itself. Several weak experts were swept away and were sent flying by his imposing aura alone. His hands were glowing with a golden light and had illuminated the horizon. Then, his hands transformed into a pair of dragon's claws. And it seemed as if they'd ripped the sky open. A seemingly endless power began to rampage in the sky. It seemed as if the thunder god, who had rushed towards Yi Shiwen, had been caught by something. In fact, he had seemingly been bound with a hoop in midair, and wasn't able to move even a bit. Rip! An unpleasant ripping sound resounded. And the phantom of the thunder god roared as this sound reverberated. He had soon been ripped apart in midair. And purple-colored blood started to drip down from his body. Everyone was stunned as they witnessed this scene. They hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen could be so powerful. Everyone had clearly felt the thunder god's phantom strength even though they were very far away from him. In fact, an ordinary expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm would have gotten killed and would have been reduced to mere dregs by just one attack of this phantom. Thunder God was Pang Yongbo's trump card. So, how could he be ordinary? However, even he couldn't withstand a single move of Yi Shiwen's. Many people suddenly started to despair. They would have had an opportunity to make a comeback if Yi Shiwen were a little stronger than them, since they could have relied on their numerical advantage to overwhelm him. However, Yi Shiwen had surprisingly become so powerful that they couldn't take him down by merely relying on excessive manpower. And this feeling had driven them to despair. Even Pang Yongbo was in utter shock. He and Yi Shiwen had fought over a year ago. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't displayed such terrifying fighting strength in that fight. Even the fight between Yi Shiwen and his Thunder God's phantom hadn't been this relaxed and easy in the previous instance. However, Yi Shiwen had unexpectedly become so frightening in just 1 year's time. Most importantly, he didn't sense the specific fluctuations of a sage expert on Yi Shiwen's body. In other words, Yi Shiwen was still a semi-sage expert, nothing more. But how could a semi-sage expert be so frightening? He himself was at the peak of the semi-sage realm. But he didn't possess any margin to fight back against Yi Shiwen. Several experts immediately began to turn around and retreat. Such a person was extremely dreadful. These people were undoubtedly greedy, but they weren't foolish. Moreover, they didn't wish to throw their lives away. Inverted Ocean Seal. Yi Shiwen's inverted ocean seal attack crashed down. And several experts, who were escaping away at an extremely fast pace, were crushed to death by the seal in an instant. Yi Shiwen's eyes had turned ice cold. He didn't wish to let anyone get away. Chief Fifan had also stood up. He had picked up his weapon and was staring at everyone. The enlightening mind ancient tree had a great reputation. It was quite possible that many sage experts and great sage experts would arrive to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen if the news were to spread out that the enlightening mind ancient tree had fallen into his hands. In fact, it might even give rise to a violent sensation in the true martial university. And Yi Shiwen wouldn't be able to have any peaceful time if that were to happen. In fact, he might come across sneak attacks from the sage and great sage experts anywhere and anytime. And he obviously didn't wish to lead the rest of his life like that. Many people didn't respond slowly since they immediately understood Yi Shiwen's intention as soon as they saw him crush the escaping experts to death. Therefore, someone shouted out, "He doesn't wish to let us leave alive. So, we must fight with him." Many people reacted this time, not for some precious treasure, but for their own survival. Yi Shiwen sneered. These people had been scheming against him a little while ago. In fact, they had acted to kill him without mercy. Pang Yongbo was the first one to react. He had no other way out this time. So, he could only rush towards Yi Shiwen. Rumble! A big golden hand smashed down at an incredibly fast speed, just like a golden cloud. And it pounded on Pang Yongbo's body in a flash. Pang Yongbo's defense was instantaneously routed by Yi Shiwen. His armor was a defense-type treasure, but it was instantly shattered by Yi Shiwen's slap. He simply couldn't resist the power of Yi Shiwen's palm. And his body was immediately crushed by the slap, and was then turned into a mass of flesh and blood. Everyone present on the scene turned quiet, only Pang Yongbo's dying screams echoed. Everyone was stunned. They hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would turn out to be so powerful. Pang Yongbo was the strongest among them. Yes, he was very young. However, nobody thought that he was weak. What would they call themselves if they called him weak? However, even a powerhouse like him didn't have the power to fight back against Yi Shiwen. Could it be that Yi Shiwen had already achieved invincibility against contenders who were below the Sage Realm? Chief Fifan was also dumbstruck when he saw this happen. His fellow younger brother had become outrageously powerful. He couldn't help but recall the rumors he had heard about Yi Shiwen. This was the third Heaven's Pride expert to die at his hands. Moreover, all three of them had been well-known and dreadful experts. In fact, Pang Yongbo was far stronger than the other two. So, it seemed as if the disparity between these people and Yi Shiwen had widened further. Yi Shiwen wasn't even in Legendary Realm at the time he had stepped on the ancient road. However, he had just killed a semi-Sage Realm expert, as if the youngster were a piece of cake. Yuan Hongzhou's complexion had turned ugly on the other side. He didn't harbor a sentiment of deep hatred for Yi Shiwen like Pang Yongbo and young Master Feng had. However, he knew that Yi Shiwen wanted to kill every last one of them. How could he not have guessed the reason? How could he not have become frightened and furious at this? However, he didn't get much time to think. Yi Shiwen's eyes turned ice-cold and ruthless as he suddenly dashed towards Yuan Hongzhou like a golden god of war. Yuan Hongzhou was the only one who could pose threat to him among these people. The others were nothing but mediocre. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had rushed straight towards Yuan Hongzhou. His footsteps shattered the space. And his incomparable imposing aura swept across and engulfed everything in its path. Yuan Hongzhou was barely able to prevent himself from being sent flying away. "All of you, do you wish to sit still and wait for your death?" Yuan Hongzhou roared as he saw Yi Shiwen charge towards him. He wanted to divert Yi Shiwen's attention. However, Yi Shiwen didn't give him the opportunity to continue with his speech. His palms seemingly ripped the sky open and instantly broke Yuan Hongzhou's defense. After that, he arrived in front of Yuan Hongzhou and attacked. Bang! A loud bang sounded, and the bones in Yuan Hongzhou's body got crushed by the massive force of the attack. The bone fragments swirled in the air, and blood gushed out of his body. Bang! Yuan Hongzhou's tall body loudly crashed headfirst into the ground. His eyes had turned lifeless since his soul had been crushed by Yi Shiwen. Chapter 429. Another man had died. Many people were already despairing since there wasn't any margin for concessions in the current situation. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had already demonstrated his intentions in a very clear manner, and he wouldn't allow them to leave. So, they had no other option but to go all out and fight for their lives. "I will fight with you," an expert roared and advanced forward. However, he was killed by Yi Shiwen in just one slap. In fact, he didn't even get a chance to fight back. Then, Yi Shiwen attacked and killed several experts in a flash. The sonic booms dissipated in all directions, and the energy soared into the sky. Moreover, he had killed them in just a slap. Yi Shiwen had become 10 times more powerful than his previous self. These hundreds of experts were also regarded as elites. However, they were nothing in front of his current strength. Therefore, they had been slapped to death by Yi Shiwen. The blood slave and Qi Fifan had also joined in on the hunt. The blood slave was as unfeeling as a robot. So, it didn't show any mercy and continued to kill people left and right. And Qi Fifan began to attack relentlessly as well. He knew very well that he mustn't allow these people to escape. Yi Shiwen might come across all kind of troubles if these experts managed to escape. Moreover, even he might get implicated into Yi Shiwen's troubles. 3 peak experts had joined hands. So, these merely dozens of leftover experts had been effortlessly sent to their deaths in a short period of time. Then, Yi Shiwen collected the spatial rings and other treasures from the bodies of these elites. One must know that each one of these experts was an elite. So, they possessed over 2 million primary spirit dawn on their bodies in total. Moreover, each of them possessed bountiful resources on their bodies, especially Yuan Hongzhou, Young Master Feng, and Pang Yongbo. These 3 experts were regarded as elites among elites by their respective forces. And they were Heaven's Pride experts. So, they would naturally possess many good resources on their bodies. Yi Shiwen and Qi Fifan didn't stay for long after they had cleaned the battlefield. Yi Shiwen had killed 3 Heaven's Pride experts at once. More than hundreds of elite experts had died at his hands as well. And this would certainly shake this entire planet. Therefore, they wouldn't dare to stay here for a long time. These 2 individuals rapidly flew out. They left this huge planet and returned to the Wind Dragon City. They heaved a sigh of relief only after they had safely returned. "Brother, I didn't expect that I would meet you here." Qi Fifan looked at Yi Shiwen. He was deeply moved. Yi Shiwen had been very lucky this time. It was merely Yi Shiwen's good fortune that had led him to the jackpot. And the Enlightening Mind ancient tree had recognized him as its master. Yi Shiwen had already transplanted that sprout of the Enlightening Mind ancient tree inside the heavenly source mirror. Therefore, it had essentially become his private property. And his speed of comprehending the principles would increase very significantly with its assistance. Even I hadn't anticipated that things would turn out like this. Yi Shiwen grinned. He hadn't anticipated that the Enlightening Mind ancient tree would unexpectedly choose him as its master. But it had momentarily seemed as if Yi Shiwen would get killed because of it, since Pang Yongbo and Young Master Feng were the only ones who had wanted to kill him before the start of this matter. But it eventually developed into a situation where his martial training was benefited. However, this Enlightening Mind ancient tree was the main culprit behind all of it. "Senior brother, I didn't hear any news about you after I entered the True Martial University. Which peak are you on?" Yi Shiwen asked. Qi Fifan explained everything to Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen found out that Qi Fifan had coincidentally gained a great opportunity right after he had entered the True Martial University. And the Supreme Lord of the University had made him his last personal disciple. So, he had been undergoing closed-door training this entire time. Moreover, the genius who had become widely popular in the outside world by the name Great Radiant Senior was none other than Qi Fifan. Yi Shiwen suddenly figured it out. Qi Fifan had been chosen by the Supreme Lord to be his last disciple. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that his cultivation had advanced by leaps and bounds in such a short time. The sheer amount and level of resources one could obtain by being the last disciple of the True Martial University's supreme leader was far beyond Yi Shiwen's imagination. This cultivation was like a bandit's dream. However, Yi Shiwen's cultivation had also advanced by leaps and bounds after he had entered the Hidden Star Peak. In fact, it had even gone far beyond Qi Fifan's expectation. Yi Shiwen felt like laughing out loud. People would be greatly amazed if they found out the origins of the Heavenly Phoenix body, the Great Radiant Senior Expert, and his. They would probably be surprised since many people might not have heard where Yuan School was located. However, they might be scared to death if they would come to know that 3 Heaven's Pride experts had come from the Yuan School. My reputation is mostly assisted by my identity as the last disciple of the Supreme Lord. It's far less thrilling than your world-shaking reputation. You have gained your name and fame by killing several Heaven's Pride experts. Chief Fifan looked at Yi Shiwen and said. Yi Shiwen was still the same as he used to in Yuan school. He still couldn't tolerate any injustice. And he still couldn't eat the slightest loss either. After all, who could make him suffer defeat? In fact, the very thought of it was ridiculous. Most people to arrive at the true martial university hailed from different regions. So, they dealt with the others in a very cautious manner. Yi Shiwen was the only exception. He had earned a great reputation right after he had entered the true martial university. He had openly offended and dealt with law enforcement disciples. Most people couldn't even imagine doing something like that. For them, offending law enforcement disciples was akin to courting death. However, Yi Shiwen was still alive and healthy. But those who had gone against him hadn't met a good end. It wasn't surprising that many people privately called Yi Shiwen a calamity star, since he caused people troubles wherever he went. Yi Shiwen had also heard about this bad reputation of his. However, he felt that he was being treated unjustly. He wouldn't have killed all those people if they hadn't come to kill him. He wasn't a homicidal maniac, or a devil that would kill people indiscriminately for no reason. What thrilling! I didn't have any other choice. Yi Shiwen laughed helplessly. He wouldn't have desired to build such world-shaking reputation if he had been given a choice. And he wouldn't willingly kill people in order to attain such world-shaking reputation. However, he had been left with no choice but to kill. He would have had a pleasant journey, and could have cultivated under favorable conditions if he could be like those other Heaven's Pride experts. And he wouldn't have to bother about a lot of other stuff. After all, who wants to make enemies all the time? However, there was no way out since he had already trod this path. There was no turning back. He could only overcome the obstacles and move forward. It just so happens that Sister Hua is also here. She's undergoing closed-door training. Yi Shiwen spoke up. But I don't know if she has come out or not in the last more than a year's time. Yi Shiwen had deliberately allowed her to stay in the Wind Dragon City since he had felt that taking her along might be risky. So, it was better to let her stay in the Wind Dragon City because it was guarded by the powerhouses of the Sage Realm. Let's go together. Chief Fifan laughed and said. These two individuals had come out from the Yuan school. Therefore, they had gotten even closer since they had come to the same true martial university. And they had involuntarily embraced each other as a group, just like the people of Qingfeng Mountain had embraced each other as a group after they had arrived in Yuan school. They soon arrived at the inn where Yi Shiwen and Hua Menghan had lodged for undergoing closed-door training. They arrived and saw that Hua Menghan was arguing with a tall and handsome middle-aged man about something. Yi Shiwen felt a terrifying sense of danger from the aura being emitted from the body of that middle-aged man. A chill ran down his spine as a result, and his heart began to pound loudly. Yi Shiwen realized that he couldn't sense the depth of this man's power. Moreover, he hadn't even felt such a strong sense of danger from the body of a great sage expert. I'm telling you that I am a human and not a member of your clan. Hua Menghan's face exposed a bit of anger, and her beautiful face had turned slightly red. But the blood of my race flows in your body. You can't deny this, no matter what. The man seemed to have ignored Hua Menghan's anger as he replied in a solemn tone. I'm saying it for the last time, I'm not a member of your clan. And I won't go to the ancient Phoenix world with you. Hua Menghan angrily retorted. Her complexion had turned red. Ancient Phoenix world, Yi Shiwen's complexion immediately changed. He had heard Yi Mo speak of this world. Yi Mo had said that the dragon race and the phoenix race had once coexisted. But the folklore stated that these races had already vanished without any trace. However, a great majority of members of these races were living in seclusion. The dragon race was living in the true dragon world. And the phoenixes had chosen a world known as the ancient phoenix world, to live in seclusion. It was said that an ancestor of the phoenix race had established a world for their people many ages ago. And this world was independent from the 10,000 worlds. So, nobody knew where this place was located. Yi Shiwen had merely considered this as hearsay, nothing more. He didn't take it seriously, he didn't care much either. The dragon world and the ancient phoenix world existed in fables alone as far as he was concerned. They were very far away from the bounds of his imagination. Damn. Yi Shiwen, this man isn't human. Yi Emo suddenly uttered, this man is a phoenix, and he has merely taken a human form. Phoenix? Yi Shiwen was sent in extreme shock. He hadn't doubted the existence of the phoenixes. However, he hadn't anticipated that he would be able to see a phoenix one day, and that, too, in this way, Chi Fifan hadn't heard Yi Mo's voice. However, he could also feel the terrifying aura from the body of this man, and felt that it could make a person suffocate. In fact, one look from this man could suck one up into the bottomless abyss. One would then lose oneself and one's sense of reality. This was exceptionally dreadful. It's possible that the blood inside this girl's body has attracted this phoenix. Yi Mo continued, Humph! The blood of the heavenly phoenix. For you, that man suddenly shouted. Then, a horrifying sonic boom swept towards Yi Shiwen and Chi Fifan. It struck them and sent them flying. They knocked against the entrance gate of the inn and sent it flying. But the entire inn was empty. So, there was no one inside. It seemed as if the people had long been scared away. Yi Shiwen suddenly felt a strange stiffness in his chest. He spouted a mouthful of blood. And the look of horror was clearly visible in his eyes. That middle-aged man was far more powerful than his imagination. Hua Menghan reacted when she saw that Yi Shiwen and Chi Fifan had been sent flying. Yi Shiwen, Brother Chi. Hua Menghan shouted in a startled manner. Her figure drew a long line of red flames as she arrived in front of those two. She then hastily asked, Are you two okay? We're fine. What's going on here? Yi Shiwen asked. He faintly had a premonition in his heart that something bad was going to happen. Chapter 430. We are fine. What's going on here? Yi Shiwen asked. He faintly had a premonition in his heart that something bad was going to happen. That man looked arrogant. So, he didn't pay any attention to Yi Shiwen. Perhaps, Yi Shiwen wasn't qualified enough to demand his attention. He faintly said, Young man, there are some matters which you are better off not knowing. So, the less you know the better it would be for you. And it would be better if you ask fewer questions unless you wish to disappear from this world. There are some matters which you'd better off not knowing. That man coldly warned. Yi Shiwen became furious. However, he didn't act rashly. He clearly knew the disparity between himself and that man. And it was like the difference between cloud and mud. Yi Shiwen was perhaps like an ant in the eyes of that man. I know you're not a human, but a phoenix. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth. He stared firmly at that man as he spoke. That man's complexion changed abruptly. He hadn't expected that Yi Shiwen would know his identity, that he was a phoenix. And his killing intention rose as a result. Hua Menghan distinctly felt that man's killing intention rise. So, she immediately shouted at that man in order to stop him. I will kill myself right now if you dare to touch them. Then, you won't be able to obtain any blood whatsoever. That man's complexion changed significantly. He looked at Hua Menghan and realized that she was determined. She wasn't kidding. And she might genuinely kill herself if he were to attack Yi Shiwen and Chi Fifan. That would obviously be a great loss for him. Therefore, he could only look bitterly at Yi Shiwen as he spoke. You're quite lucky, young man. The heavenly phoenix blood was very important for his clan. And he obviously knew that this might be the only opportunity to obtain the extinct heavenly phoenix blood. Moreover, the elders of his clan would blame him if he committed any mistake. So, he couldn't afford to commit such a grave mistake. Young Miss Hua, it doesn't matter whether you're willing or not. This matter has already alarmed the old elders of my race. So, there isn't any margin for turning this matter around. That man continued, I request you to understand the urgency of the desire my clan harbors for the heavenly phoenix blood. You will be able to attain the status of senior female saint in my clan if you willingly come with me. In fact, you will enjoy great benefits as long as you are willing to come with me. The man solemnly said, I don't want to. Hua Menghan gently bit her lower lip and replied. Yi Shiwen's heart was suddenly stirred up. He became frightened the moment he heard about Hua Menghan's departure. And he suddenly realized that she had an enormous position in his heart, a position that no one else could take. He merely had a vague feeling in the beginning. However, the words of this man had cut like a knife. And the intense feeling that resulted from this realization sobered him up. Yi Shiwen, the current situation isn't good. This girl's blood has caught the attention of the Phoenix race. So, they will surely take her away. Yi Mo said, the Heavenly Phoenix clan is the most respected clan among all the Phoenix clans. However, they vanished along with the disappearance of the Phoenix ancestor. And that had happened a long time ago. But the Phoenix race has been looking for the traces of possible leftover blood of Heavenly Phoenix clan in every world ever since. Phoenixes usually aren't as lascivious as the dragons, but they've also left their bloodline behind in various worlds. And these people have finally found this girl. So, how can they not take her away? She doesn't wish to go with you. So, why are you forcing her? Yi Shiwen glared at that man. He clenched his teeth and asked, why yes? Some things don't need any reasons. This is fate. That man looked eerily at Yi Shiwen and said, it's just like you will never be able to access the entire world. And you can only struggle in this mortal world like an ant. And it's just like ants can't understand the vastness of the sky the way an eagle does. This is fate. But you don't deserve to know so much. The man had become somewhat impatient, and his terrifying imposing aura had completely shrouded Yi Shiwen. The bones inside Yi Shiwen's body made rattling sounds as they rubbed against each other. In fact, he couldn't even raise his head due to the immensity of this pressure. Fate? Oh, fate. I don't believe in fate. I control my fate, not the heavens. Nobody can control my fate. Yi Shiwen shouted. His golden divinities began to surge on his body and broke through the imposing pressure of that man's aura. Then he slowly stood up. But his entire body was covered in sweat. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe that someone could dominate his life. He believed that his fate was in his own hands. Well, very nice. You're quite ambitious, but... That man coldly shouted. He then disappeared before Yi Shiwen's eyes. And he suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen in the very next second, and pressed him down onto the ground with his palm. Bang! Yi Shiwen was nailed down to the ground in one slap. And the bones throughout his body had been shattered. Many people in the world can kill you since killing an ant isn't a difficult task. That man's voice was ice cold as he said this. His killing intention was boiling because he had realized that Hua Menghan liked this young man. Perhaps he also possessed some affection for her. Therefore, the man didn't wish this kind of a situation. Looking at the present situation, it would be better if he could kill Yi Shiwen. Stop! Hua Menghan yelled. However, that man's killing intention had already risen. He brought his foot down in order to crush Yi Shiwen's head. And it seemed as if he would trample Yi Shiwen to death. Bang! An extremely terrifying power emerged out of Yi Shiwen's body. And a big furry hand instantly popped out from his body. It struck the sole of that man's foot with a bang and grabbed it. Bang! The terrifying collision set off boundless energy waves, and they shattered the void to pieces. However, it couldn't blow the inn off since the inn was being protected by a powerful barrier. That man was shaken by the tremendous force and hurriedly retreated. In fact, he retreated several steps, and a large chunk of void was shattered under his footsteps. He withdrew quite far away and eventually came to a halt. But he was indefinitely bewildered as he looked at Yi Shiwen. However, he was surprised to see a huge specter emerging from Yi Shiwen's body. It was a ferocious-looking and exceptionally aggressive devil in reality. Its flaming aura soared high and wasn't one bit inferior to that man's. How is a devil expert here? I'm Feng Ling, the patrolling inspector of the Phoenix race. I've been sent here to handle some matters. I hope your excellency won't interfere. That man, Feng Ling, looked at that specter indefinitely puzzled. I don't care about your Phoenix race's matters. I'm determined to protect these people. That senior specter opened his mouth and spoke. His voice made a rumbling sound. It was similar to that of a big bell. Get lost. Don't force me to attack. Otherwise, even the reputation of your phoenix race won't be able to save you. Feng Ling shouted, It's impossible. You should be aware of the fact that even a single vein of heavenly phoenix's arteries is very important for our phoenix race. Do you wish to wage a war between the devil world and our ancient phoenix world? If you really wish to protect them, then I won't have any other option but to fight with you till death. Feng Ling firmly replied. A flame began to ignite from his body. It then began to boil. You let them go. And I'll come with you. Hua Menghan looked sad, but she had spoken with determination. Young Miss Hua is ready to come with me. That's the best case. Feng Ling opened his mouth and said, he had wanted to kill Yi Shiwen to prevent him from divulging the secret. However, Hua Menghan had finally changed her decision. Moreover, that senior devil expert had also scared him since he could potentially be a very difficult opponent. Yi Shiwen. Hua Menghan looked at Yi Shiwen. This guy had raised his head for her sake. He was fully aware that he was no match for Feng Ling. However, he still stood up to him. He was really insane. Hua Menghan didn't know what to say. She was reluctant to leave. But she merely shot a glance at Yi Shiwen, turned around, and flew out of the window and trod on the rainbow light. She soon disappeared into the horizon. Feng Ling shot a quick glance at Yi Shiwen and said, You were lucky this time. You mustn't try to look for her. Otherwise, Hua Menghan won't be able to save you even if she personally steps in. Oh no, it seems that a human like you won't be able to know where to find her in your entire lifetime. Feng Ling's facial expression was brimming with arrogance. He had looked down on Yi Shiwen. Forget about indulging in a talk with Yi Shiwen. He would have mercilessly killed Yi Shiwen if that devil expert hadn't suddenly emerged out from Yi Shiwen's body. Feng Ling transformed into a group of flames after he had spoken those words, and flew out in the direction of Hua Menghan. He disappeared before everyone's eyes in no time. Yi Shiwen, what's going on? Qi Fifan was the most confused individual on the scene. And he was still in shock. He had just seen a phoenix, a race he had only heard about in the fables. Yi Shiwen had openly exposed that man's identity. And that man hadn't denied it either. However, his killing intention had risen greatly. So, how could Qi Fifan not have understood that Yi Shiwen's words had been true? He had never imagined that he would get to see a phoenix one day. The phoenix race was synonymous with tyrannical strength in the legends of this universe. However, they had disappeared countless years ago. It was often heard that someone had seen the birds and demon beasts that possessed the phoenix blood. However, the real phoenixes had disappeared, just like the real dragons. Hua Menghan had apparently inherited the most precious bloodline of the phoenix race. Qi Fifan suddenly recalled Hua Menghan's nickname out of the blue, Heavenly Phoenix Body. However, Qi Fifan was even more surprised by the fact that a devil expert had suddenly emerged out of Yi Shiwen's body. He was determined to believe that Yi Shiwen wasn't possessed by a devil. And Yi Shiwen hadn't shown any symptoms of it either. In fact, there wasn't any indication that he could transform into a devil. Yi Shiwen clenched his teeth. Then he heaved a sigh of relief, and that huge specter faded away before his eyes. It disappeared without a trace. Only the voice of Yi Mo echoed in his ears. Yi Shiwen, that specter was my doing. It was only meant to scare him away. But you must leave quickly. It's possible that the Phoenix guy might come back to kill you. And I've overspent my energy in that sudden thrust. So, I'm going to lie dormant for some time to restore my energy. And you're on our own until I wake up. It turned out that the devil specter was merely the result of Yi Mo's projection. And it was only designed to frighten the enemy, nothing more. It was completely harmless in reality. Its imposing aura was only useful in scaring a person. And it wouldn't be able to withstand a single blow in reality. Chapter 431. Yi Shiwen spouted a mouthful of impure energy after a few breaths' time. His bodily injuries had almost been repaired by now. The consequences would have been too horrible if Yi Mo hadn't acted on time. In fact, it was hard to imagine what could have happened since Yi Shiwen didn't have any power to fight back against this man. Even Yi Mo had ended up falling into deep slumber after he had helped him. And it was uncertain when he'd wake up. Ancient Phoenix World. No matter where this place was, Yi Shiwen would go to the ancient Phoenix World sooner or later, and he'd bring her back. Feng Ling. Yi Shiwen had to go through this all because of him. So, he would make him pay back twice over in time. Yi Shiwen had never felt so helpless. He didn't have enough strength. He didn't have anything. He was merely like a lump of meat that had been placed on the chopping board. Anyone could come and take him away. Even Hua Menghan was forced to sacrifice herself in order to save him. Moreover, Yi Mo had to fall into deep sleep for the sake of his life. Yi Shiwen's former goal was to practice unceasingly and grow stronger. But his main goal had suddenly shifted to the ancient Phoenix World. And he would find this place sooner or later. Yi Shiwen secretly vowed in his heart. And he firmly clenched his fists. In fact, his fingertips deeply pinched into his palm, and blood flowed out. However, he seemed totally oblivious to it. "Brother, are you okay?" Qi Fifan became worried, and asked as soon as he saw Yi Shiwen. The incident that had taken place hadn't been directed at him. However, he had also survived because of Hua Menghan's sacrifice alone. So, he too felt extremely aggrieved in his heart. However, he didn't wish to see Yi Shiwen in a depressed state. Otherwise, what would be the point of Hua Menghan's sacrifice? "I'm fine. Let's go." Yi Shiwen finally opened his mouth and replied. Then he stood up. His voice was dull, and his expression was strangely tranquil enough to scare a person. "It's not safe here. There's no guarantee that Feng Ling won't come back to attack us." Qi Fifan nodded. He had become even more anxious after he saw Yi Shiwen like this. It would be better if Yi Shiwen could vent out his frustration. "Brother, don't be sad. Sister Hua would feel bad if she were to see you like this." Yi Shiwen grinned. "I'm fine. This ancient Phoenix World is nothing. I will smash it to pieces one day, and I'll bring her back then." "Good, this is what a true man of the Yiyuan school would say." Qi Fifan applauded. He heaved a sigh of relief as he heard Yi Shiwen's words. The thing that he was most worried about, fortunately didn't happen after all. "Brother, let's return to the university." Yi Shiwen had a firm look in his eyes. He would walk to the top, step by step, even if the ancient Phoenix World were to be located above the ninth heaven. He would become a great sage if the sage realm wasn't enough. And he would continue even further if the great sage realm wasn't enough. He must attack and turn the ancient Phoenix World upside down, even if it were a dragon's pool or a tiger's cave. Qi Fifan nodded. He also knew that it wasn't safe here. They would be doomed if Feng Ling came back and attacked them. Therefore, these two individuals didn't delay. And they returned to the True Martial University without making any stoppages on the way. But they came back, and they found out that the news about that huge planet had spread throughout the True Martial University. And the deaths of the 3 top-tier Heaven's Pride experts of the 3 different major forces, along with hundreds of elites, had shaken the true martial world. However, it wasn't the casualties of the younger generation that had shaken the entire true martial world. After all, they were still very young. So, they didn't have any current importance. The current strength of the major forces wouldn't decline even if all of them were to die. However, the fact that had shaken them was that these youngsters had set out to look for the enlightening mind ancient tree. Such a legendary and magical tree had only existed in legends by far. Therefore, countless experts had begun to seethe with excitement. One's cultivation would increase by leaps and bounds if they could obtain this enlightening mind ancient tree. It would certainly advance by leaps and bounds. The enlightening mind ancient tree, the precious treasures of the wind dragon, and that palace of some ancient mighty force. These 3 massive elements had stimulated many Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm experts of the true martial world. And they had left for the Wind Dragon's huge planet. The experts of the Wind Dragon City and several nearby cities had also flocked towards this planet. This had made that huge planet quite chaotic. In fact, this had shoved this already chaotic planet into an even greater mess. Yi Shiwen was somewhat glad after he heard that many experts of the Sage Realm had moved into action. He was thankful that he had already departed from there. Otherwise, how he could have escaped later? That huge planet had become a restricted area for the younger generation after the arrival of several sage experts. The experts of all the big forces had gathered there in abundance. So, an expert below the Sage Realm would literally become their food if he were to go there. Moreover, these people were always ready to strangle the young experts of the enemy forces while they were still in cradle. However, the most important matter for the new disciples of the true martial university was the upcoming martial arts competition that would take place between the four forces. Not everyone would participate in this time's martial arts competition. In fact, not all Heaven's Pride experts would get to take part in it. However, it would undoubtedly be a major event. This martial arts competition had also taken place in the past. And all the Heaven's Pride experts had participated in it at that time. And all of them had been killed as a result. But everyone had learnt from that experience. So, the forces wouldn't allow the entirety of their Heaven's Pride experts, or all of the elite disciples to participate in this competition at once. According to the rules, the four forces would host the martial arts competition alternatively. And it was the true martial university's turn this time around. Therefore, Yi Shiwen didn't need to go to any other place ahead of time. None of the major forces dared to look down on this time's martial arts competition. It could by and large be said that this competition among the new disciples would determine the relative power of these forces for a quite long period of time in the future. However, a disciple of some force might emerge as an outstanding genius by defeating the others in this event. And a war might get sparked among the forces in the future as a result. Yi Shiwen didn't say anything after he returned to the true martial university. He merely isolated himself inside his room and started his closed-door training. Qi Fifan knew about the pain in Yi Shiwen's heart. However, he didn't have any words to remonstrate it right now. Day by day, time passed, while Yi Shiwen underwent the closed-door training. And the day of the martial arts competition among the four forced finally arrived. True Martial University was already a lively place. But it had suddenly become even more crowded. Everyone was excited. This martial arts competition was going to take place between four forces. So, the people of these four forces had obviously arrived here. However, several people of many other big forces had also arrived to watch this event and examine their strength. This event would also reveal the muscles of these four forces to the outside world. But most importantly, it would reveal their strengths to each other. The more outstanding the performance of their disciples, the higher their evaluation would be. Moreover, this event was also a means to deter other people from casually resorting to rise against their position of power. Streamers of lights of different colors landed in the true martial university. The representatives of various forces, especially the representatives of the other three forces, arrived one by one in big groups. Many elders of the true martial university had come out in order to welcome the guests. They showed great importance to the visitors on the one hand, but they also deterred the possible misconduct of errant people on the other hand. Brother Yi has been undergoing closed-door training for such a long time. Why he hasn't come out yet? Deng Shuixin seemed somewhat anxious as she looked at the place wherein Yi Shiwen was undergoing the closed-door training. Yang Wenjun stood beside her, but he looked rather comfortable. He wasn't worried at all. The two of them had finally entered the Sage Realm after a few years of non-stop practice. In fact, they had recently come out of their closed-door training. Their innate talent was a bit inferior to that of Bai Jiansong's and the others in Hidden Star Peak. However, they were rare geniuses in their merit. Moreover, they had the accumulation the worth of over 100 years. And their improvement hadn't been minor after they had obtained the complete version of the Hidden Star Scripture. In fact, they had stepped into the semi-sage realm in one fell swoop. Both of them were in the sage realm now, and had been promoted to the rank of core disciples. Therefore, there was a difference of heaven and earth between their current status and their status of the past. Therefore, they were especially grateful to Yi Shiwen. They might have had to try for countless years to reach to this level if it hadn't been for Yi Shiwen's contribution. There was no problem with their accumulation of energy. The main problem was that they didn't have the complete version of their core cultivation method. They were forced to be very careful at every step of their cultivation in the past. Therefore, their progress rate had been much slower than other people. However, their accumulation and foundation were very profound. So, they would have advanced by leaps and bounds if they had proper cultivation method from the beginning. They had also heard that Qi Fifan and Yi Shiwen had returned together. And Qi Fifan had told them about Hua Menghan's matter. He didn't speak of what had come to happen between Hua Menghan and Yi Shiwen in a clear manner. However, it was enough to let these two know that Yi Shiwen's present situation wasn't quite good. He needed time to adjust his mental state. Relax. Brother Yi has always been a strong person. So, this level of mental shock shouldn't be a problem for him. Yang Wenjun said. Yi Shiwen had joined this peak only a few years ago. However, he knew that Yi Shiwen was an exceptionally strong person. He wasn't the type of person who would weep endlessly. But the martial arts competition between the four forces will start soon. So, he would miss this competition if he doesn't come out of his closed-door training. Deng Shui Xian said. Let him miss it if he wants to. It doesn't matter whether he goes to this martial arts competition or not. Yang Wenjun had perceived it well. This martial arts competition was a good opportunity for an average disciple to become famous. However, did Yi Shiwen really need to make a name for himself? He didn't. In fact, he had always been eager to keep a low-key profile so that he could avoid the unwanted attentions of other people. Creak. The door of the room, where Yi Shiwen was undergoing the closed-door training, opened. And a figure made its way out through that door. The two of them turned their gazes, and saw that it was Yi Shiwen. However, they were surprised to see that Yi Shiwen was beaming with life. In fact, there weren't any depressed expressions on his face. It seemed as if nothing had happened. Come on. Let's go and participate in the martial arts competition. Hurry up or we will miss it. Yi Shiwen spoke up as he clenched his fists. His journey to the top was going to begin with this martial arts competition. Whoosh. 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 The melodious ringing sound of a big bell reverberated. It penetrated the endless skies and spread throughout the true martial university. With this, everyone knew that the martial arts competition had finally begun. Chapter 432. The loud ringing sound of the bell announced the beginning of this time's martial arts competition. The venue of the competition was located at Metropolis Martial Peak. This peak was also one of the top 10 inheritances of the true martial university. In fact, the current Supreme Lord of the university belonged to this inheritance. In fact, it had always been the center of attraction since the beginning. Nearly all of the previous Supreme Lords in the history of the true martial university had come from this inheritance. It was the Supreme Colossus inheritance among the top 10 big inheritances. The venue was going to be inside a microcosm located at Metropolis Martial Peak. It wouldn't be carried out in the real world. After all, the experts of the semi-sage realm or above would be clashing and attacking frequently during the course of this competition. They might not be able to destroy the Metropolis Martial Peak if the competition were to be allowed in the real world. However, it certainly wouldn't be a pretty sight. But no one would need to hold back when fighting in this microcosm. And they could unleash their strongest attacks with any worry. It had been a few years since Yi Shiwen had arrived at the true martial university. However, he had only heard the name of Metropolis Martial Peak. He hadn't visited it till now. The true martial university was extremely vast. Perhaps, it wouldn't take too much time to fly past it. However, it would take a hell lot of time to visit the places one by one. Most people couldn't visit every place inside the true martial university in their lifetime. The day of the martial arts competition had arrived, and it wouldn't be an understatement to say that a sea of people had arrived here for the event. Millions of people who hailed from true martial university had arrived at the Metropolis Martial Peak to watch this time's martial arts competition. And these spectators wanted to enter this microcosm in order to watch the fights. There was a magnificent and grand, tall stage in the center of the venue, and it was shrouded in clouds and mist. People couldn't see anything clearly inside. This place was meant for the high-level experts of the major forces who had arrived here to watch the competition among the new disciples. Yi Shiwen got to the true depths of Metropolis Marshall Peak and came to know what a real sea of people looks like. The end line of the crowd wasn't visible. However, several spectators proceeded to the microcosm to take their seats as the time for the start of the competition gradually drew closer. The atmosphere soon became cold and calm as everyone waited for the 10,000 disciples who'd take part in the competition. Yi Shiwen began to ascend the flight of stone steps. He saw several disciples who had arrived to take part in the competition on his way. They all seemed very excited. Everyone was hoping to become famous in one fell swoop in this time's competition. They wanted to stand out among their peers. And they wanted to become famous in the younger generation. In addition, there were many benefits as well. Let alone the other precious rewards, there was a heavy reward of primary spirit dawn. One could get a reward of 1,000 primary spirit dawn in the first round. The second round had a reward of 2,000 primary spirit dawn. The reward would keep doubling with each successive round. And the winner of the competition would get a reward of 1,000,000 primary spirit dawn. This was an astronomical figure for anyone. It could be said that one could suddenly become a Heaven's Pride expert if they would succeed in standing out in this time's competition. Therefore, this was a second chance for those people who had already decided in advance to become a Heaven's Pride expert right after they had entered the true Marshall University. One could get the attention of the university's high-level experts if they performed well here. They might even overtake the former Heaven's Pride experts in the future if they would put their efforts into training and cultivation. This kind of thing had occurred many times in the past. Even Yi Shiwen had secretly become speechless. It could be said that the true Marshall University was bleeding money this time. The university had previously awarded him with merely 100,000 primary spirit dawn to show his importance after he had killed the second god. But they were now distributing millions of primary spirit dawn in one fell swoop. It could be said that they were spending a massive amount of money. Moreover, the primary spirit dawn were rather insignificant stuff compared to the other rewards. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that so many disciples were so excited to stand out in order to gain both fame and fortune. Even Yi Shiwen had also become somewhat excited and clenched his fists. Just you wait, Sister Hua. I will advance step by step and come to bring you back, even if I have to go to the ends of the earth. This is just the first step. Yi Shiwen knew his capability. He knew that he was quite good at present. However, he also knew that he was no better than an ant in comparison to those genuinely strong people. So, he could only continue to fight and practice with a break in order to stand out among his peers and to obtain the true Marshall University's acknowledgement. He could progress faster and go farther if he had the resources of the true Marshall University at his disposal. There were several hundred roads which could lead to the top of the mountain. Yi Shiwen had chosen one of them. Everyone here was a top-notch expert. They had already reached halfway to the Metropolis Marshall Peak in such a short period of time. A loud and clear laughter suddenly came through from around the corner when everyone was about to move ahead. And that wild laughter echoed throughout the sky. Ha ha, it seems like the true Marshall University is full of mediocre people. Xian Yuan Palace Hall's Linghu Yuan is here to ask for advice. Isn't there anyone who can teach me a thing or two? His loud and clear voice suddenly echoed everywhere since it also contained real elemental energy along with it. The complexions of several disciples of the true Marshall University immediately turned ugly. But the disciples of other forces present in the surrounding were amused as they looked at the disciples of the true Marshall University. They even sniggered up their sleeves, especially the disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. They were beaming with joy. Yi Shiwen's countenance was calm. He picked up pace and went further up. He soon arrived at a big piece of land at the corner. And he saw a 20-year-old young man clad in a white robe standing there. He looked arrogant and overbearing. He was standing in the middle of the road to obstruct the path of the disciples of the true Martial University. The complexions of hundreds of disciples of the true Martial University had turned ugly when they saw this young man standing before their eyes. This was provocation. Moreover, it was a blunt provocation. He had dared to wander into the true Martial University's territory and had pulled a stunt like this therein. His courage was quite extraordinary. Moreover, he had blocked the way of the disciples of the true Martial University. So, wasn't this stunt obviously directed at the true Martial University? Several disciples of the true Martial University lay upside down on the ground. They were groaning and screaming endlessly. The experts of the Legendry's great complete realm, and even an expert of the intermediate stage of semi-sage realm, had been slammed to the ground in just one slap. The remaining hundreds of disciples of the true Martial University had begun to hesitate because of this. An expert of the intermediate stage of the semi-sage realm had been sent flying in just one slap. What could these people possibly do? Yi Shiwen looked. That Ling Huyuan was an expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. He had condensed 900 Dao principles. So, he wasn't one bit beneath that deceased young Master Feng. Basically, he was only a bit weaker than some of the Heaven's Pride experts. So, it wasn't very surprising that he was courageous enough that he had dared to intercept them at the halfway point to the mountaintop. This was a ruthless attempt to lower the face of the true Martial University. Moreover, the true Martial University's reputation would decline in front of so many forces. And these people could only watch this, but there was nothing they could do about it. Moreover, they were unable to go up the stairs. Some people wanted to take the other road to reach to the top of the mountain, but there was a possibility of getting obstructed again. Moreover, they might arrive late and may get disqualified as a result. And that would be a big loss for them. The true Martial University had many experts. However, the problem was that it seemed as if there was no one on this road who could compete with Ling Huyuan. And the experts of the older generation couldn't interfere because that would be considered as bullying the junior. And this would decrease their reputation big time. They would lose their face even if they got rid of Ling Huyuan. This was a typical example of a small fight with big outcome. The true Martial University couldn't afford to lose its face at any cost. There would have been no problem if he had only obstructed a path without targeting anyone. Everyone would have considered it as a joke and would have laughed it off. The true Martial University indeed had many experts. However, it would be very disgraceful for the true Martial University's younger generation if the experts of the older generation were forced to move into action. Is there no one in this big true Martial University who can teach me a thing or two? This is very disappointing. Ling Huyuan deliberate put on a pitiful look on his face as he said. Yi Shiwen looked at Ling Huyuan and sneered. This young man looked insolent and arrogant. However, he was quite cunning in reality. Several Heaven's Pride experts had already arrived at the venue early morning. So, the disciples present here right now weren't the elite crowd. Moreover, there were only a few hundred disciples present on this road. So, there was a very small probability of him coming across a Heaven's Pride expert. His strength was quite tyrannical. In fact, nobody could be his opponent unless they were a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, it could be said that his strength of 900 Dao principles was enough to deal with a Heaven's Pride expert and escape if necessary. Therefore, he didn't need to be afraid as long as the disciples of the older generation didn't interfere. This Ling Huyuan is too arrogant and despotic. It is said that he enjoys a very good reputation in the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Many people have said that he's capable of becoming a Heaven's Pride expert. Look at this strength. He's not a Heaven's Pride expert, but he isn't far off either. He's extremely fierce. Why isn't he looking for those Heaven's Pride experts? You know, he's just embarrassing us. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall can only play cheap tricks like this. This is extremely hateful. Most of the disciples around Yi Shiwen were exceptionally angry. Young man, you mustn't act too arrogantly. A figure leapt up from the crowd of disciple. He had stood behind Yi Shiwen. It was an expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. He had condensed 700 Dao principles. You're not my opponent. Ling Huiyuan merely shook his head. He simply didn't pay any attention to this expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. Less empty talk and more action. That expert of the late stage of semi-sage realm rushed forward. A boundless energy wave swept out with him. He fired his punch. It carried boundless fist energy. The fist energy then distorted altogether and condensed into a long dragon. And it advanced towards Ling Huiyuan to attack him. The faces of the disciples of the true martial university simultaneously exposed bright smiles. It's brother He Xinhong of the peaceful water peak. There should be no problem now. Yeah, brother He Xinhong has always been strong. He can be considered at the top among the experts who are ranked right below the Heaven's Pride experts. Yi Shiwen heard this, and felt that this name sounded somewhat familiar. This man was apparently a well-known figure among the younger generation, and possessed incredible strength. However, Yi Shiwen shook his head and said, "No. He Xinhong is indeed powerful. However, there's a big difference between the strengths of both parties." The keen gazes of Yi Shiwen and the others fell on He Xinhong to read his power. He was certainly powerful. However, there was clearly a big disparity between him and Ling Huiyuan. However, the disciples of the true martial university who were beside Yi Shiwen became somewhat furious as they heard what Yi Shiwen had spoken, since they found their own prestige and vigor extinguishing in front of the enemy's rising power. Ling Huiyuan sneered as Yi Shiwen's voice faded away. He suddenly trod forward and went all out, like a fierce tiger. He shot his palm, and it swept out like a gigantic hand. It crushed He Xinhong's offensive in a flash. It had struck and broken that powerful fist energy, and He Xinhong went flying in just one slap. A severe light then flickered in Ling Huiyuan's eyes, and the other palm went towards He Xinhong's dantian to destroy his martial cultivation. Chapter 433. Ling Huiyuan charged on fiercely. He had destroyed He Xinhong's dantian in a slap. A sinister look flashed on his face. He might give an excuse later on that he had done it by mistake and then avoid any trouble for it. Blades and swords have no eyes in the martial arts competition's battles. This is an unavoidable fact. He might not have launched an attack on some average person. However, He Xinhong had made him feel threatened. He Xinhong obviously wasn't a match for him. However, he was regarded as a skilled expert in the true martial university. So, this had been the best opportunity to get rid of even one of their good experts. True martial university is just for show. It seems to enjoy an undeserved reputation. Ling Huiyuan laughed wildly after he saw that he was about to succeed in his plan to belittle the true martial university. Arrogant and despotic, these two words appeared in everyone's mind. Even those barbarians of Muddy Sky Island and Fire Cloud Cave who had eagerly waited to see the mockery of the true martial university felt that Ling Huiyuan was far too arrogant and despotic. The true martial university had an illustrious fame. It had ruled the entire true martial world at one point of time in the past. Even the Lord of Xianyuan Palace Hall wouldn't dare to say that the true martial university enjoyed an undeserved reputation. True martial university enjoys an undeserved reputation? Pumph. Your bloated tone is as empty as a toad's yawn. A loud shout resounded. Then, a big golden hand swept towards Ling Huiyuan to crush him. This big hand set off boundless gales. It seemed as if it would crush the world as it pressed down. The space in the vicinity of the metropolis Martial Peak had been strengthened countless times. So, it was quite difficult even for the attack of a great sage expert to rip apart this space. However, this attack was incomparably dreadful. Ling Huiyuan promptly let off He Xinhong and retreated frantically. In fact, he had retreated hundreds of feet at a quick pace. Rumble! That big hand crashed on top of the mountain, and it opened a crack on this road. The might it carried was simply endless. The extremely arrogant Ling Huiyuan's face exposed a somewhat frightened and doubtful look. He was astonished as he looked in Yi Shiwen's direction. He shouted, "Who are you?" The others also looked one after another. They wanted to find out who had actually forced a top expert like Ling Huiyuan to retreat. Ling Huiyuan wasn't a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he was a quasi-ranked character of Heaven's Pride level. In fact, not all Heaven's Pride experts would be able to deal with him. However, that big hand had forced him to retreat. Such was the strength it had carried. Could it be that it was an attack from some expert of the older generation? "It's me," Yi Shiwen faintly spoke up. He stepped out with large strides and coldly looked at Ling Huiyuan. How could they not have seen how he had slaughtered the senior disciples of Law Enforcement Hall, that too on his very first day after he had entered the true martial university? Had they not seen how he had single-handedly messed up the disciples of the War Dead Star Peak after they had dared to blockade the Hidden Star City? Moreover, this wasn't the most important fact on Yi Shiwen's list of merits. The fact that Yi Shiwen had slaughtered 2 Heaven's Pride level experts in the past had boosted the confidence of this pack of disciples of the true martial university. One among those experts was Fong Ming, and the other one was the second god. Yi Shiwen was truly the strongest man in the younger generation. Ling Huiyuan could at best retreat while facing a Heaven's Pride expert. But how would he face the man who had slaughtered not just 1 but 2 Heaven's Pride experts? He had messed with the wrong person. This could be considered as the biggest misfortune of his life. These people obviously didn't know that Yi Shiwen had killed several Heaven's Pride experts and hundreds of elites on that Wind Dragon's planet. Otherwise, they might have been scared to death. Strongest Heaven's Pride expert? Iron Wall? Yi Shiwen was a bit depressed after he heard this evaluation. Cheap? Do you think that you have the right to speak about others? Yi Shiwen sneered and walked over. Do you know what place this is? Who owns this place? This is the true martial university. You dared to make a big fuss thinking that nobody from our true martial university can tidy you up. Isn't that right? You are really a moron since you thought that you could lower the reputation of our true martial university by pulling such a lame stunt. Yi Shiwen sneered. I flung that big slap on you to warn you to not act too arrogantly. Wasn't the other person more arrogant and troublesome than Yi Shiwen? Yi Shiwen hadn't wished for this. However, he had come across several challenges after he had entered the true martial university, whether big or small, and had advanced through them to reach here. Therefore, he had already caused several troubles. Yi Shiwen's strong voice faded, and he swept out a big palm towards Ling Huiyuan. Yi Shiwen's palm was wrapped in golden threads. It instantaneously arrived in front of Ling Huiyuan to kill him. The fight had broken out in that very moment. Yi Shiwen had attacked without giving any warning. His attack had sent sonic booms in all directions, even though he hadn't exerted the entirety of his strength. Ling Huiyuan wanted to dodge the attack. However, it seemed as if he had lost his determination to avoid the attack in that very moment. Yi Shiwen had moved extremely quickly. He had appeared in front of Ling Huiyuan within the blink of an eye. Bang! Ling Huiyuan was sent flying by one big slap. His body span in midair at a great speed due to the great force. Then he heavily smashed down on the ground. Ling Huiyuan was messed up badly. He spouted a mouthful of blood as his teeth fell out. Yi Shiwen hadn't used his entire strength. His skull would have been smashed if that had been the case. Life or death didn't matter in the arena, but Yi Shiwen couldn't kill him here, even under the guise of a mistake. This slap was to teach you to behave with integrity and not act too arrogantly. Yi Shiwen sneered. There will always be someone more arrogant than you. Yi Shiwen didn't mind being labeled as arrogant by other people. However, he was compelled to take up the challenge this time. He and this arrogant cocky guy weren't same. He didn't care about what kind of hatred the true martial university and Xian Yuan Palace Hall possessed for each other. However, he wouldn't just sit idly while someone would bully others before him. Yi Shiwen passed from Ling Huiyuan's side after he was done speaking. He then walked up towards the top of the mountain step by step. Everyone was astonished. They were left in shock as they saw this scene in front of their eyes. Even the disciples of the true martial university hadn't anticipated that the situation would turn like this. They felt that Ling Huiyuan had messed with the wrong person. However, they hadn't thought that Yi Shiwen would use a mere slap to crush his arrogance and temperament. It was a very neat slap. That extremely tyrannical Ling Huiyuan was no better than the opponents whom Yi Shiwen had defeated previously. Defeated in one move. Everyone was kind of scared. A chill ran inside their bodies. Was this the true strength of a Heaven's Pride expert? Ling Huiyuan, who was known to be a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert, couldn't even stop one move and had been sent flying. Everyone was convinced that he would have died in just one slap if Yi Shiwen had used his full strength. How could they ever accomplish their goal of distinguishing themselves when such a person was around? However, the majority of people weren't ambitious for the top position. They knew the limits of their own strengths quite clearly. Yi Shiwen didn't care about how terrified everyone behind him was. He went straight to the hilltop. Tables had been arranged in rows on the top of the mountain. A group of the elders of the True Martial University were seated in the front row. They were in charge of distributing tokens to the participants. Everyone had to draw out a token by themselves. One would go to different locations and would fight with their opponents based on the token drawn. Yi Shiwen drew out a token. He looked at the number 3,500. It wasn't a forward position. Other disciples also reached to the top of the mountain in succession, soon after Yi Shiwen did. The time for the beginning of the martial arts competition had soon arrived. Ding dong! The loud sound of the bell reverberated through the sky. A figure came down flying from above the tall stage. He was tall. He was clad in a magnificent robe. He carried an incomparably noble aura around himself. However, his face wasn't visible clearly. He was True Martial University's Supreme Lord. He was the one in charge of countless disciples of the True Martial University. The True Martial University had conducted the martial arts competition this time. Therefore, the Supreme Lord had personally arrived to preside over the overall situation. Yi Shiwen looked at him. However, he couldn't see through his strength. It was said that the Supreme Lord had already surpassed the Great Sage Realm. Yi Shiwen had inquired about it from Qi Fifan. However, Qi Fifan told him that he didn't know either. He hadn't met the Supreme Lord often, even though he had been appointed as the last disciple of the man. Therefore, he couldn't guess the real strength of the Supreme Lord. However, Yi Shiwen could somewhat tell based on his last few years of experience in the True Martial University that faintly discernible aura present on the body of the Supreme Lord wasn't like the oppressive aura of Great Sage Realm. Chapter 434. I hereby announce the official beginning of this time's martial arts competition between the four forces. Countless daos flashed in the sky along with the official announcement of the Supreme Lord. Several microcosms, which would be used as venues for the martial arts contests, appeared one after another. Those tokens were the keys to enter the microcosms. A participant could enter the corresponding microcosm with the token in his hand. Suddenly, the disciples let out gigantic clamors. There were more than 10,000 participants this time. Each of the four major forces had contributed 1/4 of the total number. The weakest among these disciples were the experts of Legendry's Great Complete Realm. In fact, Yi Shiwen used to be in this realm a few years ago. And they weren't one bit inferior to how he used to be back then. Their foundation looked deep and profound. Their auras had been fluctuating on their bodies in the beginning, but had then exploded to unleash an incredible power. One could actually sense the traces of semi-sage level power mixed in their auras. Yi Shiwen moved forward with the token in his hand. He then entered the microcosm that corresponded to his token. He glanced around. It wasn't a big microcosm. It was stretched up to 10 miles. However, it still had more than enough area to spare as an arena meant for a martial arts competition. Yi Shiwen found out that his opponent had already arrived there. It was a young man, approximately 20 years old. He looked arrogant. He insipidly looked at Yi Shiwen and said, "I'm in Liqing of Muddy Sky Island. I suggest you surrender now. Otherwise, don't blame me for using my ruthless methods later." He was very arrogant. He had already at the late stage of the semi-sage realm. He had condensed more than 700 Tao principles. So, he was certainly very strong. In fact, he might have broken through several rounds quite easily if he didn't come across any Heaven's Pride expert. You sound rather overconfident. Yi Shiwen insipidly replied. Haven't you heard of me? And Li Qing asked in a surprised manner. It was obvious that he just didn't seem to care about Yi Shiwen. Many participants would investigate about the relatively famous experts in such a big competition. Some would even try to look into the top 500 experts. They would compile a big list that contained all the information about them. And several people would investigate about them in advance in order to win every battle. This was the so-called know thyself and know your enemy. Moreover, it wasn't a tough task even for the experts of Legendry's great complete realm to remember the details about hundreds of people. In fact, it was a task as easy as drinking water or eating food. This information had been traveling around for quite some time now. So, anyone could check these details as long as they possessed little bit of intelligence. It wasn't a difficult task. And Li Qing's name was listed in the list of top 200 experts. Wouldn't successfully breaking through several rounds be as simple as eating and drinking for him? In fact, he might even be able to do it with little to no effort. He believed that it was benevolent of him to allow the opponent to surrender with dignity. However, the man present before him didn't seem to appreciate his kindness. Who are you? Why should I know you? Yi Shiwen replied. He had come out of the closed door training a while ago. So, he hadn't gotten the time to check the details about the top experts and Heaven's Pride experts. It anyway didn't make any difference to him. He could deal with anyone as per his current strength. So, what know yourself and know your enemies? He considered these sayings to be nonsensical. And Li Qing's face turned red with embarrassment. Yi Shiwen had landed a slap in his face when he was being complacent. He could feel the painful heat of that slap on his face. In fact, it was even more painful than a direct defeat. Haha, this is so much fun. I was right about choosing to watch Yi Shiwen's fight. His opponent is unknowingly sitting on a barrel of gunpowder. This is so amusing. This and Li Qing is flaunting in front of Yi Shiwen. He doesn't realize that he has messed with the wrong person this time. Several disciples saw this scene and burst into laughter, especially the disciples of the true martial university. They knew that Yi Shiwen wasn't a good person to mess with. Even the Heaven's Pride experts weren't his match, let alone this guy. Bastard, you are courting death. And Li Qing's rage was enough to burn the vault of the heaven. He could feel the angst of being looked down upon. When was he ignored like this by any person? Even the Heaven's Pride experts hadn't dared to disregard his presence like this. Yi Shiwen coldly looked at Li Qing. This youngster possessed excellent strength. However, he was far inferior to Yi Shiwen. You will regret this. I will break each one of your bones, one by one. And Li Qing was burning with anger. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. And killing intention flashed in his eyes. So, you will break my bones one by one? Let's see whether you have the skill or not. Yi Shiwen sneered. Clang. And Li Qing brandished his long sword. An endless sword intention flew across the vast sky. The sword's pressure spread in all directions. And the long sword in his hand transformed into a long dragon and swept towards Yi Shiwen, as if to devour him. Yi Shiwen sneered and attacked. But it wasn't some splendid move. He had merely brandished his palm as a ferocious slap. Rumble. The surrounding space was shattered by the attacks of these two individuals. Yi Shiwen remained entirely still. However, Li Qing went flying by the blast. It's impossible. Li Qing looked at Yi Shiwen unbelievably. Yi Shiwen had remained motionless and had casually welcomed his attack. This shouldn't be possible even for a Heaven's Pride expert. Yi Shiwen finally moved at this time. He suddenly trod forward. He was all alone, but his imposing aura seemed to carry the might of a magnificent army with thousands of men and horses. His powerful aura seethed and swept all across. The golden divinities were wrapped around Yi Shiwen's palm. He then pounded his palm on Li Qing's chest at a lightning speed. Bang! Li Qing didn't have the strength to withstand this attack. And he was sent flying by Yi Shiwen's slap. The bones in his chest were broken in their entirety. He spouted a mouthful of blood and fell unconscious. Even his token fell down from his hand and rolled away. Yi Shiwen had won in one move. How could this be? This is impossible. The spectators who had taken note of this battle were in complete uproar. They couldn't believe their eyes. Nobody knew Yi Shiwen apart from the disciples of the true martial university. Therefore, they were quite optimistic about Enlicheng. They believed that Enlicheng could hold his own with dignity even while facing a Heaven's Pride expert. However, he couldn't even withstand one move from this man. How's this possible? Who is this man? How he can be so powerful? Is he a Heaven's Pride expert? Don't you know him? He is Yi Shiwen, our true martial university's famous Heaven's Pride expert. A disciple of the true martial university proudly spoke up. He is Yi Shiwen. Everyone exclaimed with amazement. Yi Shiwen was a low-key man in comparison to other Heaven's Pride experts, but he was usually a part of high-profile matters. He was usually involved in matters that had caused sensations everywhere. However, he was basically reclusive behavior-wise, unlike other Heaven's Pride experts. Many disciples who had taken part in this competition knew about him. However, it was very rare for outsiders to recognize him. Several disciples of other forces were present in the surroundings. And the disciples of the Muddy Sky Island were particularly optimistic about their own expert. Who would have thought that he would come across a calamity star like Yi Shiwen in the very first round? Just one slap had left him to lose consciousness. It would have been fine if it had turned into fierce struggle between the two. But they simply couldn't endure such an outcome. The complexions of the disciples of the Xianyuan Palace Hall had turned even uglier than theirs. Their faces had turned as ashen as the facial expression of a dead housefly. Yi Shiwen had just defeated a disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. However, he had killed a Heaven's Pride expert of theirs. So, they felt more pain and discomfort when they saw Yi Shiwen happy. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen is the winner of this fight. Yi Shiwen suddenly heard a majestic voice. It was the voice of an elder. Yi Shiwen came out of the microcosm once he heard the judgment. Then he appeared above the public square of Metropolis Martial Peak, post his exit from the other space. The loser of the match was taken to some other place. This area was for the winners, so that they could enjoy the attentions of thousands of people. Of course, only winners deserved such treatment. The number of audience was quite less this time. Only a few spectators had arrived since the competition had just begun. The fights would last long only if there wasn't a big difference in the strengths of the contenders. Otherwise, they would be like Yi Shiwen's fight in which they'd take down their opponent in just one move. The first round wasn't too difficult. There was hardly any pressure on the experts of the semi-sage realm, unless they were extremely unlucky like Enlicheng. But everything was dependent on luck for the experts of Legendry's great complete realm. They might get through if they came across a weak opponent. However, they could easily get eliminated if they were to come across a stronger opponent. Yi Shiwen. Suddenly, a somewhat familiar voice sounded from behind. Yi Shiwen turned around. He saw a figure clad in green clothes. A woman arrived wandering around with a faint smile on her face. She turned out to be one of the 4 pro-disciples of Yi Yuan School. It was Shui Yen Luo. Sister Shui. Yi Shiwen hadn't thought that he would come across Shui Yen Luo here. They used to be the focus of public attention when they were in Yi Yuan School. So, it wasn't difficult for them to find each other. However, they had submerged inside a boundless sea of people after entering the true martial university. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had only been able to find a few acquaintances from the Yi Yuan School so far. Of course, neither she nor Yi Shiwen had seriously tried to find each other. They hadn't been very close friends in the past. They were extremely excited to meet here like this, but they were just going with the flow. Brother Yi finished it very fast. It seems that you came across a fairly weak opponent. Shuiyan Luo laughed and said. She was somewhat surprised in her heart in reality. She didn't expect that she would see Yi Shiwen here. Yi Shiwen had never deliberately tried to find his old friends of the Yi Yuan School. However, that didn't mean that she was ignorant about his matters. After all, his matters were always high profile. It could be said that he had caused huge sensations one after another. Not many people knew about Yi Shiwen at the time he had entered the true martial university. He had garnered a glorious reputation on the ancient road, but it still wasn't enough to make him famous in the true martial university. However, who didn't know his name now? Who wasn't aware of his feats now? She knew much more about him compared to him since he didn't know anything about her. There were several Heaven's Pride experts in the true martial university. However, 3 of them, Yi Shiwen, Hua Menghan, and Qi Fifan, had come from Yiyuan School. This fact had been suppressed by some people with high ambitions. Else, it would have inevitably shaken the true martial university. After all, the true martial university's disciples had come from various different regions. Yiyuan School was merely a small place in front of the true martial university. However, it had still produced 3 Heaven's Pride experts. So this news would have caused a huge uproar. Chapter 435. Brother Yi finished it very fast. It seems that you came across a fairly weak opponent. Shuiyan Luo laughed and said Yi Shiwen smiled, but didn't reply. And Li Qing was weak? He obviously wasn't weak. He could have easily burst into top 500 experts if he hadn't bumped into Yi Shiwen. However, he had been eliminated in the first round itself. One could say that he had been treated unjustly. I didn't expect to see Sister Shuiyan here, Yi Shiwen said. He looked at Shuiyan Luo. She had also entered the semi-sage realm. However, she was merely at the initial stage of the semi-sage realm. The principles on her body also looked somewhat unstable. This clearly meant that she had recently entered the semi-sage realm. She could be regarded as elite in this generation. However, she couldn't be compared with Qi Fifan and Hua Menghan. These 2 individuals had chanced upon their own respective fortuitous meetings. They couldn't be regarded as ordinary. You've become a very busy man now. It's not surprising that you didn't get the time to look for us. Shuiyan Luo teased Yi Shiwen. She also sighed in her heart. They used to be called the 6 pro-disciples in the past. However, the disparity between them hadn't reduced. It had grown bigger and bigger on the contrary. This was the result of having met with different fortuitous encounters. My bad. Sister Shuin, please forgive me. Yi Shiwen repeatedly asked for forgiveness and said, Oh, by the way, our Sister Shuiyan and Brother Huang are still in touch? He still recalled that man used to as cold as ice. However, he wasn't a bad person. There hadn't been any news about him after he had entered the true martial university. Well, of course. Shuiyan Luo replied. Yi Shiwen had started his journey late. So, he wasn't in contact with these people. However, these people belonged to the same batch and had started their journey together. Therefore, they were obviously in touch. So, they knew each other's whereabouts. That's great. I wish to give a dinner party tonight. Let's gather everyone. Consider it to be an apology from me. Yi Shiwen said. This was a rare opportunity for a get-together for all the disciples of the Yiyuan school. This time's martial arts competition wouldn't end in one day. Only 3 rounds would take place today. But the remaining rounds of this competition wouldn't be completed in a single day. It would continue for several days. Yi Shiwen quickly met with a few other senior disciples of Yiyuan school after he followed Shuiyan Luo. Some of these disciples had lost in the first round, while some had won. He also saw the man who was still as cold as iceberg, Huang Luochen. Huang Luochen's temperament was entirely different from that of Qi Fifan's. Everyone laughed and talked. It didn't take too long for the first round to end. The second round would begin soon. Yi Shiwen, Shuiyan Luo, and Huang Luochen had passed the first round. So, they left for their respective competition microcosms. Yi Shiwen took the initiative and entered his microcosm. His opponent hadn't arrived yet. He waited for a while, and his opponent eventually arrived. It was a tall guy of the barbarian race. He was approximately 2 meters tall. He was carrying a big club on his shoulder. It was made up of wolf's tooth. He was a bit surprised to see Yi Shiwen. He grinned and spoke up, "You'd better admit defeat without wasting any time. It's still not too late. It won't be good for you if my club were to pound on you, just in case." He was a senior expert of the late stage of the semi-sage realm. He had condensed over 700 Tao principles. Yi Shiwen smiled back. This disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave was somewhat funny. He sounded a bit rude and impolite from his words, but he clearly didn't have any bad intentions. He genuinely wanted to warn Yi Shiwen. And Yi Shiwen developed a good impression of him because of this. Yi Shiwen hadn't anticipated that he would come across two peak experts of the late stage of the semi-sage realm in the first 2 rounds only. It was either their bad luck, or his. I would like to know whether it will pound on me or not. Yi Shiwen replied with a smile, let's fight. You southern humans are very troublesome. Here I come. The voice of that Fire Cloud Cave disciple faded away soon enough. An enormous imposing aura emerged out from his body and swept across. The aura seemed mighty and grandiose. It had a wild touch to it as well. This disciple had already practiced the power techniques of the Fire Cloud Cave to perfection. So, his attack wasn't ordinary like the Fire Cloud's falling sky hand that was used by the ordinary disciples of Fire Cloud Cave. Bang! A loud explosion sound was heard, and that disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave suddenly disappeared. He only left a hole behind in the spot where he stood. He arrived in front of Yi Shiwen the very next instantly. He was a big guy. Only a few people would believe that he possessed such speed after they had looked at his grandiose stature. The club on his shoulders smashed down with unmatched momentum. The trace of a plain and honest smile still lingered on his face. However, Yi Shiwen's blade was far quicker. The blade in his hand immediately erupted. The blade energy swept out and slashed down in a flash. Bang! The club of that Fire Cloud Cave's disciple instantaneously disintegrated into pieces under the impact of Yi Shiwen's Dao tool. Yi Shiwen's long blade then dropped down towards his head from above. Wait, I admit defeat. I was mistaken. You southerners are very sinister. That disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave became somewhat upset and spoke up. Yi Shiwen felt a little depressed since this barbarian man had called him sinister. This was too simple for him. Could it be that the barbarian people still believed that people with bigger bodies possessed greater strength? True Martial University's Yi Shiwen has won this round. Just one move, he had won again in just one move. A peak expert of the semi-sage realm had lost in the hands of Yi Shiwen once again. He couldn't withstand one move and was defeated. Yi Shiwen's victory's speed set the moods of several spectators on fire, especially the moods of the disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave. How is this possible? How he can be defeated in the second round? He's an elite disciple of our Fire Cloud Cave. Is this Yi Shiwen genuinely that powerful? I've heard rumor that he has killed some Heaven's Pride experts in the past. Is it true or false? Many disciples were shocked by this, and they were trying to observe Yi Shiwen. Many people knew that he was ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert. In fact, many of them knew that he had killed some Heaven's Pride experts in the past. So, they weren't baffled by the fact that he had defeated someone. However, they were left shocked by the fact that he had defeated 2 powerful opponents one after another, and each with only one move. Those 2 young men enjoyed good reputations. They were considered as elites in the younger generation. Several people had guessed that they would make it into the list of top 200 experts. However, Yi Shiwen had defeated them by using only one move. He had defeated them in the same manner. The only difference was that Enliching had been defeated miserably. But the second opponent had been defeated with some dignity to spare since he hadn't been offensive. These 2 contenders had come in with high hopes. However, they hadn't thought that they would be eliminated so early in the competition. Even the 4 lords were in shock. Many high-level experts of every major force were present on the tall platform. They were shocked as well. They had given their undivided attention to the fights of Yi Shiwen and other Heaven's Pride experts. So, Yi Shiwen had gained their attention because of his brilliant performances. Yi Shiwen came out of the competition space after he had defeated that disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave. A long time span elapsed before the other disciples began to come out of their venues. The contenders who had made it to the second round were a bit more tyrannical than the ones in the first round. That's because only the disciples who had put on a good show in the first round had made it to the second round. The tall platform was hidden amidst the clouds and mist. 4 grand towers stood tall and upright above the tall platform. 4 godlike figures were seated on the thrones located atop each of those 4 towers. These 4 people wielded the power and authority over the 4 forces. The Supreme Lord of the true martial university was seated in the middle. He wasn't clearly visible. 3 pinnacle experts with tyrannical auras were seated on his either sides. Their cultivation level was hardly recognizable. One man among them was clad in a purple robe. He carried a sort of extravagance on his person. He was the lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall. The man seated beside him was clad in a bluish-green robe. The color of his robe was very much similar to that of water. He was the lord of the Muddy Sky Island. And the last one was the lord of the Fire Cloud Cave. He was an old barbarian with a robust physique. His hair was as white as the feathers of a white crane. He possessed a somewhat wild aura. He was seated upright beside the Supreme Lord of the true martial university. Is that Yi Shiwen? I heard that he has killed a Heaven's Pride expert of your Xianyuan Palace Hall. And he also taught a lesson to a young Heaven's Pride expert of yours in the Wind Dragon City. Geez, he's really outstanding. Muddy Sky Island's lord laughed mischievously and said. It was obvious from his tone that he was trying to sow seeds of dissension. Yes. The lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall merely replied with a yes, but didn't say anything further. He didn't become happy or get angry after he heard this. It wasn't clear whether he was angry or had merely treated this as news. The lord of the Muddy Sky Island shot a glance at him. But he didn't elaborate further. Some things don't need to be elaborated further. This youngster is pretty good. His approach towards this competition has been appropriate from the get-go. He treats the competition as competition, nothing more. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave unexpectedly opened his mouth at this time and spoke up. Yi Shiwen hadn't injured that disciple of the Fire Cloud Cave. That's why the Lord was quite pleased with him. Muddy Sky Island's Lord got restless as soon as he heard these words. Yi Shiwen had recently tidied up his disciple quite miserably in the first round. Therefore, he didn't wish to see Yi Shiwen. Humph. This is nothing. It's only the beginning. He won't be able to go far. The lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall couldn't help but open his mouth and said, he's not even a chief disciple. He's nothing compared to those hidden geniuses who haven't shown themselves yet. You never know when someone will defeat him. I don't think so. I think his reputation will flourish, when the time comes. The lord of the Fire Cloud Cave generously applauded Yi Shiwen. A rampant person like Yi Shiwen didn't need to be scared of anything. In fact, he himself was an extremely rampant person. So, he was quite impressed to see Yi Shiwen's no-nonsense style of handling things. He obviously didn't know that Yi Shiwen was the one who had stolen their Flaming Sun real water. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spoken such words. Perhaps, he wouldn't have appreciated Yi Shiwen if he knew this. Rather, he would have stepped off the throne and would have chased Yi Shiwen everywhere to kill him. It's too early to say whether he's a genius or mediocre. This kid is arrogant and despotic. Let's see how far he goes in the future. The lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall spoke up in a somewhat unsatisfied tone. The lord of the Muddy Sky Island looked at the Supreme Lord of the True Martial University and noticed that his gaze was fixed in one direction. It hadn't changed one bit from the beginning to end. It seemed as if he had heard nothing. Muddy Sky Island's lord merely sighed and didn't say anything. Chapter 436. Chapter 436, Many Powerful Enemies. Yi Shiwen obviously didn't know that these 4 big personalities were talking about him. But his mood wouldn't have changed even if he knew. He had goals that he must surmount in the future. The second round's results began to spread quickly among the disciples since most of the participants had finished their respective fights. Those Heaven's Pride experts will dominate this time's competition. However, you never know, someone might emerge out as a dark horse. That's difficult though. Those Heaven's Pride experts have been specially groomed by each of the major forces. The resources they obtain from their respective forces are far beyond our imagination. One can only surpass them if their innate talent goes against the heaven's will. Otherwise, it's not possible. Yeah, that's right. It said that Fire Cloud Cave's Chi-Tion is the most powerful expert this time. Barbarian God's real body is considered invincible in the entire world. He has killed his opponents in one slap in both the rounds so far. His opponents didn't even have the power to fight back. The Fire Cloud Cave has suffered heavy losses in the rounds so far, and they have sent only one Heaven's Pride expert in this competition. However, Chi-Tion has enough strength to suppress the other outstanding heroes. Barbarian God's real body? That's nothing. I think our true martial university's golden god of war Yi Shiwen is more powerful. Do you think this barbarian god's real body is more powerful than that titan's body? And was he also not killed by Yi Shiwen in the end? Yes. Our true martial university's Qin Wang and Han Bing Wang have also participated apart from Yi Shiwen. These two individuals are also very mysterious, but are also quite ruthless. Their opponents didn't even get the time to react while facing their attacks. It can be said that they aren't much slower than Yi Shiwen in defeating their opponents. Absolutely not. Your true martial university is merely a frog sitting at the bottom of the well. It can never be a match of our Xianyuan Palace Hall. Our Heaven's Pride experts are outstanding. Our Xianyuan twin stars are widely famous, and are considered unbeatable in the entire world. What Yi Shiwen? What Qin Wang? They can be easily crushed to death. I spit on you. Your Xianyuan Palace Hall is like a feather. Don't forget that your Heaven's Pride expert Fan Ming was killed by our Yi Shiwen. Moreover, Yi Shiwen has also taught a good lesson to that child Pang Yangbo. It's been so long and you still don't know who killed him. What are you so proud of? The news about that fight between Yi Shiwen and Pang Yangbo in the Wind Dragon City had already spread throughout the true martial university. It had attracted the attention of countless disciples of the younger generation. They now looked at Yi Shiwen as their idol. People had only raised their eyebrows when Yi Shiwen had killed the Titan body. The internal struggles are always far less noticeable than the external ones, regardless of the era. What's more despicable are those Xianyuan twin star experts of yours. They team up in their fights. Who wouldn't win a fight when it's 2 against 1 opponent? I can't bear to see such villainous people. True Martial University's disciples angrily spoke up to defend themselves. What are you quarreling for? There's no match for our East Sea's Emperor Chen and Hai Yaojin. They are invincible. They are widely popular among the experts of the younger generation in the entire East Sea region. The disciples of the four forces were arguing amongst themselves. However, they weren't able to convince each other. So, they could only stare at one another helplessly. It was impossible for these people to win this time's competition. So, they could only have the expectations from their own schools to win this competition and suppress the other outstanding heroes. And they were depending on the Heaven's Pride experts for that. Yi Shiwen was hearing everything quietly. Nobody could spot him in the crowd since he had restrained his breath. The people these disciples had mentioned were strong opponents. These 8 Heaven's Pride experts were the frontrunners in this time's competition. The result would change only if someone could make a sudden rise. Otherwise, the winner would be one among these 8 powerhouses. Yi Shiwen heard a familiar name, Emperor Chen. He had heard it last on the Demon Island. He was one of the 2 individuals who had left the most profound impression on him. The other individual was Qin Shui. These 2 individuals were undoubtedly the 2 strongest experts among the geniuses who had been summoned to the Demon Island from the 10 countries of the Southeast region. Yi Shiwen had obviously indulged in a fight with him at that time. However, he had soon realized that he wasn't a match for Emperor Chen. Moreover, Emperor Chen had been very hostile towards Yi Shiwen, and Yi Shiwen was quite wary of him because of this. In fact, the matter concerning 8th Prince Yu Yi's life and death had nearly sparked a major fight between Yi Shiwen and Emperor Chen at that time. Would there be an extension of that unfinished fight here? Yi Shiwen was quite wary of Emperor Chen even now. However, he must defeat him or even kill him in order to win this time's competition. He wouldn't mind killing Emperor Chen if given the opportunity. He knew that Emperor Chen must still be hostile towards him because he had killed the 8th Prince Yu Yi despite the warning from Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen felt that his prestige had suffered a huge damage because of that. Moreover, one could say that such enmity wouldn't change because of change in circumstances for an arrogant person like him. Yi Shiwen knew that the opposite party wouldn't let go of any the chance to kill him either, if given the opportunity. Yi Shiwen was also wary of Xian Yuan's twin star experts. He was wary of them because he would have to fight with two individuals at the same time. The twin star experts always fought as a team. They represented fire and water properties respectively. Both of them were ranked as Heaven's Pride experts. Therefore, one could imagine the dreadful might of these two individuals as a team. They were considered invincible in their region. And their accomplishments weren't just for show either. Yi Shiwen was especially wary of these two individuals. He didn't care about other Heaven's Pride experts since they weren't a matter of concern for him. For example, his gilded tyrant form itself was far superior to the barbarian god's real body of Qi Tian. In fact, Yi Shiwen's gilded tyrant form had also benefited a lot from the flaming sun real water. So, he knew how intrepid the flaming sun real water could make a body. This guy wasn't an ordinary person. Yi Shiwen sighed. The road to winning this competition was full of dangers and obstacles. However, he had no other choice but to attain victory. No matter who among these 8 individuals is stronger or weaker, we aren't a match for any one of them. I hope we can advance for several rounds without coming across them. We can obtain more and more rewards round after round if that happens. Yeah, that's right. The best thing would be to surrender if we bumped into any of them. Otherwise, we might get killed on the spot by these eccentric Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, the slightest delay can be fatal. This competition was incomparably cruel since the hidden objective was to kill the Heaven's Pride experts of the other forces. Hence, one should expect no mercy if they bumped into the Heaven's Pride experts. Yi Shiwen closed his eyes to regain his composure. Shuiyan Luo and the others also came out soon. Shuiyan Luo and Huang Luochen had experienced a daunting fight this time, but things had thankfully ended without any mishaps. But more than half of the other disciples of Yi Yuan school had been eliminated. Yi Shiwen knew that more than half of the remaining disciples of the Yi Yuan school would probably get eliminated in the next round. In fact, Shuiyan Luo and Huang Luochen might come across bitter fights in the next round. Fortunately, I didn't encounter a very strong opponent this time. Shuiyan Luo patted her bountiful chest and said, she looked somewhat glad. You will sooner or later. Huang Luochen casually spoke up, cold as always. Everyone knew that his disposition was like this only. He was always frank and didn't care about anything. Can't you hope for something good for me? Shuiyan Luo stared coldly at Huang Luochen and said, I'm only speaking the truth, nothing more. Huang Luochen insipidly replied. The Shuiyan Luo snorted angrily. Are you Yi Shiwen? Yi Shiwen seemed amused as he watched these two people talk. That was when the voices of two individuals sounded from behind him in unison. These were extremely sinister voices. Yi Shiwen turned around to see. 2 young men were approaching him side by side. They looked exactly the same. They had an imposing appearance, the vigor of a dragon, and the ferocity of a tiger. They were walking in sync with one on the left and the other on the right. The only difference between the two was the young man on the left had red hair and beard, and the one on the right had aqua blue hair and beard. The unexpected arrival of these two had made Yi Shiwen and other people tense. Aren't they Xian Yuan twin stars? Why are they looking for Yi Shiwen? Are they planning to start the fight ahead of time? We will get to watch good show now. There's a strong feud between Yi Shiwen and Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Fan Ming had been killed by Yi Shiwen. Even a well-known genius like Pang Yangbo, said to appear once in several millennia, had been defeated miserably at the hands of Yi Shiwen. One can only imagine the kind of hatred and desire for revenge they must hold when it comes to Yi Shiwen. Tut tut. Xian Yuan twin stars. Yi Shiwen immediately understood that these two individuals were brothers. The one on the left with red hair and beard must be the older brother Huaqi, and the other one was the younger brother Hualan. Both of them were extremely ferocious. Yi Shiwen, you're pretty good. Even we know your name. You must be very proud of yourself. The older brother Huichi opened his mouth and said, "We weren't aware of the situation here since we were on an expedition. However, we heard that you are quite the savage after we returned. That trash Fan Ming was killed by you. However, it doesn't matter now. You will soon die at our hands. So, make sure you cherish your remaining days well." Yi Shiwen was speechless. He was baffled by what he had just heard. Who's more savage between me and you two? My savagery is easily dwarfed, and is basically rendered insignificant in front of madmen like you two. I wonder what you'd say if you were to find out that Pang Yongbo was also killed by me. Yi Shiwen obviously wouldn't reveal that. He might end up being chased for the rest of his life if he revealed this secret. This may not have much to do with Pang Yongbo's death, but with the enlightening mind ancient tree. So, Yi Shiwen would never risk revealing the secret. It would be very detrimental since he didn't possess enough strength to fend for himself. I have nothing to say if the entireties of your Xianyuan Palace Hall's Heaven's Pride experts are planning to die at my hands. Yi Shiwen coldly replied. These Twin Stars experts were truly powerful. The most important aspect was that they would always attack as a team, regardless of the situation. It wasn't known what price had been paid to make the major forces permit the participation of these two brothers as a team. Your razor-sharp mouth can't save your life. Hualan coldly said, wash your neck properly, okay? The future of the true martial world is in the hands of us Twin Stars. Only we are the absolute, whereas everyone else in the world is as transient as a fleeting cloud. Well, look at you two making empty promises so blatantly. I just hope you are a bit stronger than Fan Ming and Pang Yongbo at the very least. Yi Shiwen continued to speak in an indifferent manner. We will soon find out who's the one to talk big. You won't be living for long. So, cherish these last days of your life properly. Twin Stars experts spoke up in unison. Then they turned around and left. They had a haughty attitude. They had simply looked down on Yi Shiwen. It could be said that he was already a dead person in their eyes. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see a fight right here. Even the domineering personalities like Xianyuan Twin Stars and Yi Shiwen didn't dare to start a fight in private. Of course, that's a given. Several great sage experts are overseeing this competition. The disciples can't possibly dare to break the rules and regulations. Yi Shiwen didn't get time to think much since the third round started soon. He grasped the token and entered the designated competition space. Chapter 437. Yi Shiwen entered the competition space for the third round. His opponent had already arrived there and was waiting for him. However, Yi Shiwen became surprised as soon as he saw his opponent. He couldn't help but smile since he was familiar with this man. This man was Li Fei. He also belonged to the Yi Yuan school. He was one of the disciples who had been taken away from the Yi Yuan school back then. Yi Shiwen hadn't seen him in last 10 years. He had already entered at Legendry's great complete realm. Moreover, he had fought all the way to the third round. There used to be some enmity between him and Yi Shiwen in the past. However, Yi Shiwen had never paid much attention to him. Perhaps, it could be said that Li Fei didn't pose any threat to him. Li Fei had been in the true martial university for many years. However, he and Yi Shiwen could be regarded as peers of the same generation. He was the descendant of a former disciple of the true martial university. He was born and raised in the true martial university. However, he was only considered an unofficial personnel of the true martial university at that time. He had been officially enrolled as a disciple of the true martial university when the university had officially started to recruit disciples. There was an intrinsic difference between an unofficial personnel and an authentic disciple of the true martial university. Li Fei was also surprised to see Yi Shiwen. He forced a faint smile on his face. He hadn't anticipated that he would come across a calamity star like Yi Shiwen in the third round. He and Yi Shiwen had faced off in small skirmishes in the past. He had wanted to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen in the past. However, such thoughts had disappeared from his mind once Yi Shiwen had gradually risen to fame like a rising star. One would become very jealous if the opposite party turned out to be a bit more ferocious. However, one would leave the thought of fighting altogether if the opposite party turned out to be far more ferocious. This was Li Fei's current way of thinking. He knew that he and Yi Shiwen weren't on the same level from the beginning. He couldn't compare himself with Yi Shiwen even in the wildest of his thoughts. "Brother Yi, I confess that I'm not your match. Therefore I surrender." Li Fei didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to speak anything and spoke up first. He was a bit bigger than Yi Shiwen in stature. However, Yi Shiwen was far powerful than him. They were of the same generation. So, only their strengths could make a difference. Yi Shiwen gawked for a moment. He hadn't anticipated that his opponent would admit defeat so straightforwardly. A whole new level of respect emerged inside Yi Shiwen's heart for him after this. True Martial University's Yi Shiwen is the winner of this fight. The voice of the referee elder reverberated throughout this space. The first day of the tournament finally came to an end along with the completion of the third round. Yi Shiwen, Shuiyan Luo and the others went to the Metropolis Martial City. It was situated under the Metropolis Martial Peak. It was the core peak among all the peaks of the true Martial University. In fact, the Metropolis Martial City was the capital city of the true Martial University. So, it was the most bustling city of all. Even the Hidden Star City undoubtedly differed by quite a margin from the Metropolis Martial City. The disciples of different inheritances and every major force had lodged in the Metropolis Martial City. They had already booked their places long ago. It would be a lot better if they stayed here since they would be able to leave for Metropolis Martial Peak for tomorrow's competition with convenience. Yi Shiwen had booked the biggest restaurant of the Metropolis Martial City. He had invited Shuiyan Luo, Huang Luochen, and the other disciples of the Yiyuan school for a dinner party. Qi Fifan hadn't participated in this time's competition. However, Yi Shiwen had asked him to come as well for this rare get-together. Yi Shiwen escorted them to a private room in the restaurant. Each of them acquired their seats. Not many disciples of the Yiyuan school were there in true Martial University. Therefore, one private room was big enough to accommodate them all. Even then, there was a lot of space to spare. Today, it's a rare opportunity for our get-together. So, I raise a toast to everyone. Yi Shiwen raised a toast and spoke up. "Brother Yi, we've had several parties. Only you didn't have the time." Qi Feifan teased Yi Shiwen and said. He felt a bit relieved to see that Yi Shiwen wasn't in a deep sorrow. Yeah. Yes. The other people also began to boo in agreement. Everyone joined up after Qi Fifan took the initiative to tease Yi Shiwen. It seemed as if they had returned to their old days in the Yiyuan school. It no longer felt like the true Martial University. There was a difference of heaven and earth between the two. They weren't very familiar with each other in the Yiyuan school. However, they looked very close to each other in this foreign land of the true Martial University. This was the best restaurant in the Metropolis Martial City. The delicacies served here were like treasures. They were very delicious and extraordinary. The atmosphere gradually turned ardent as everyone's cups interlocked in cheers. Everyone ate and drank to their heart's content. Suddenly, they heard a burst of noises coming from downstairs. Everyone sent out their divine senses one after another to have a look. A special kind of matrix barrier was established inside this private room. So, the divine senses of the people couldn't come inside the room from outside. However, people inside this room could send their divine senses outside. Everyone was surprised to see a middle-aged man standing downstairs. He was clad in a scholar's robe and looked like a storyteller. He had walked inside the restaurant. So, several disciples who were present in the restaurant had surrounded him. Everyone's eyebrows immediately wrinkled up. He looked like an ordinary scholar of legendary realm. However, nobody dared to look down on him because they knew about his background. He had a mysterious origin. He belonged to the all-knowing scholars. Nobody knew when the all-knowing scholars had appeared in this world. They just knew that these people had been around for a very long time. They could be often seen in the tea houses and restaurants of various regions. These storytellers belonged to an organization known as All-Knowing Scholars. They possessed the most perfect knowledge of the entire world. There was hardly any matter that they didn't know. So, one could obtain any information as long as one had sufficient money to pay. Nobody dared to look down on these people, or bully them even though they were physically very weak. This was simply because people didn't wish to face the retaliation of an organization like the All-Knowing Scholar. Many powerhouses had owed them favors over the years. Such an unseen yet accumulated soft power was sufficient to make a force disappear. So, one could well imagine the tyranny of the All-Knowing Scholar. Not many people knew the origins of the All-Knowing Scholar. However, they understood that the more they would know, the scarier it would get. Therefore, nobody dared to investigate too much about them or overstep the boundary. Even Yi Shiwen was very interested in their organization. He wanted to know how such a big organization functioned from the shadows. However, he was merely interested, nothing more. Of course, not all storytellers belonged to this organization. Everyone knew that the All-Knowing Scholar was an enormous force. How else would they be able to obtain the kind of information which other big forces couldn't? Everyone knew that it was a very big organization and had many branches. However, the All-Knowing Scholar had never projected itself on a large scale. In fact, a place like the Yuan School didn't even have a real All-Knowing Scholar. It only had some subordinate who operated in that area as storytellers. There was only one real branch of All-Knowing Scholar, even in a place like the True Martial University. And it was in charge of handling the information network of the True Martial University. In fact, nobody knew how many informants worked for the All-Knowing Scholar. Many people would say that the All-Knowing Scholar alone had sufficient amount of informants to maintain a smooth and unhindered flow of information throughout the intelligence network. There were many legends about the All-Knowing Scholar. Yi Shiwen also knew some of those. They had never participated in any disputes among different regions of the true martial world. They were merely responsible for selling information. And they could give all kinds of information as long as one could pay them the corresponding price. These storytellers were the subordinates of the All-Knowing Scholar. However, most of the people referred to each storyteller as All-Knowing Scholar. Anyway, they didn't have any names of their own. The major forces were quite wary of the All-Knowing Scholar. However, they had turned a blind eye to their operation since they hadn't heard of them participating in any kind of dispute or chaos over the years. The All-Knowing Scholar had become very popular, especially now during the competition. They had information on every disciple. In fact, they had circulated most of the information about the disciples. The completion of the first 3 rounds had ended. So, many disciples were asking for the information about their tomorrow's opponents from the All-Knowing Scholar. Most people were trying every means to inquire who would be their opponents in tomorrow's fight. The only exception was Yi Shiwen, because he possessed extraordinary self-confidence. People wanted to find out their opponent's identity. So, they could then follow the so-called saying of know yourself and know your enemies and collect data on their opponents. Yi Shiwen wasn't arrogant. He was just self-confident. 3 rounds would take place tomorrow as well. He might as well look for a block of tofu and bang his head on it to kill himself if he couldn't even cross the first 6 rounds. The All-Knowing Scholar would hear people's queries and would then take out jade sheets from his spatial ring. The information that these disciples were seeking was written on those sheets. There was a whole bundle of information. There was so much information that even Yi Shiwen could barely see all of it. Yi Shiwen noticed that Shuiyan Luo, Huang Luoqin, and other disciples who had fights tomorrow were somewhat excited. After all, neither of them possessed incredible self-confidence like Yi Shiwen did, nor could they stay calm like Qi Fifan since he hadn't participated. They wanted to go down and buy the information which they needed from the All-Knowing Scholar. They didn't need to know about their opponents in tomorrow's fight, but they would find out if they asked the All-Knowing Scholar. After all, it wasn't a random competition, it had certain rules. Therefore, it would save them a lot of trouble if they knew things beforehand. Everyone was about to go down and purchase the information from the All-Knowing Scholar when they suddenly saw 2 tall figures march in. They were the Xian Yuan twin stars, one on the left and the other on the right. And the 2 of them arrived before the All-Knowing Scholar. They looked at him disdainfully. Aren't they the Xianyuan twin stars? What are they doing here? Why do they wish to obtain information? Who can withstand their joint attacks? They don't need any information, do they? They obviously don't pay attention to ordinary people. However, what if the opposite party is a Heaven's Pride expert? Haven't you heard that these two were looking to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen today? Perhaps they wish to know specific information about Yi Shiwen. You don't say. These Heaven's Pride experts haven't competed against each other yet. Therefore, it's very hard to know who's stronger. So, it's quite normal if they are a bit cautious. The disciples of each force made some guesses. The all-knowing scholar raised his eyes to see. His expression remained unchanged as he indifferently asked, "What kind of information do you wish?" "We want intel on a person." The Xianyuan twin stars replied in unison. It seemed as if their minds were linked or something. All-knowing scholar asked, "East Sea's Emperor Chen." The twin stars replied together, "We are only concerned about him among the disciples who have arrived here this time. Others are mediocre." The complexions of the disciples of the East Sea's Muddy Sky Island didn't change. However, the complexions of the disciples of the True Martial University and the Fire Cloud Cave had turned ugly as they heard this. Their faces had turned red since their Heaven's Pride experts had been looked down on. Chapter 438. Xianyuan twin stars had been arrogant and domineering since the beginning. They had arrived here a few days ago. So, it hadn't been very long, but they had already become very popular. Moreover, it was visible to everyone that they were arrogant and despotic. They considered everyone to be beneath themselves. Arrogant, domineering. Not many people had known about these two brothers in the past. However, everyone would obviously become familiar with these Xianyuan twin stars after this event. Yi Shiwen clearly sensed several bad auras locking onto these two brothers while they were speaking. One among them was a man clad in common clothes. He was seated upstairs. He was emitting extravagance from his body. Another man was seated opposite to this man. He was clad in an aqua blue robe. He appeared a bit devilish. Yi Shiwen swept out his divine sense. That man clad in ordinary clothes possessed an overbearing, imposing aura, like that of a conqueror. He was none other than Emperor Chen. So, the other man who was clad in aqua blue robe ought to be the infamous sea demon Jin Wushuang. The twin stars brothers hadn't spoken loudly. However, who among the spectators didn't possess excellent martial power? It doesn't matter how low their voices had been. They couldn't have eluded the outstanding vigilance of the surrounding people. "Gee, it seems like these two individuals have come from a domain where you're famous." The sea demon Jin Wushuang laughed mischievously. He looked towards Emperor Chen and spoke, "They should have come to you directly. What do you say?" "These two are arrogant fools, that's all." Emperor Chen replied indifferently. "You are more arrogant than these two, you know." Jin Wushuang spoke up without a trace of politeness in his voice. "Perhaps nobody can surpass you when it comes to being arrogant." "I'm confident." Emperor Chen replied. "Nobody can be my match unless they are a sage expert. Saying that you aren't arrogant reflects how arrogant you really are." Jin Wushuang quietly said. He sensed Yi Shiwen's divine sense sweeping toward them at this time. He merely snorted, and the resultant vibration dispersed Yi Shiwen's divine sense. However, Yi Shiwen didn't mind his divine sense being dispersed since he wasn't being stealthy in the first place. His focus now shifted downstairs on that all-knowing scholar. The all-knowing scholar read out the entirety of the gathered information on Emperor Chen as per the request made by the twin stars brothers. Emperor Chen's information soon appeared in front of Yi Shiwen's eyes. Emperor Chen's origin was a mystery. Nobody knew about his background. Nobody knew which force he had taken birth in. They only knew that he was first seen in the southeastern region. He had become even more famous after he had participated in a battle in the Demon Island. Emperor Chen didn't join the True Martial University like most other experts of the southeastern region at the time when every major force opened their gates for new disciples. He joined the Muddy Sky Island on the contrary. Then, a reputed elder of the Muddy Sky Island took him as his apprentice. However, this wasn't the end of his magnificence. Emperor Qin was genuinely valiant. He has already killed 4 Heaven's Pride experts. Nobody in the East Sea region dares to mess with him. The all-knowing scholar insipidly said. 4 Heaven's Pride experts. Everyone gasped. They hadn't anticipated that Emperor Chen would turn out to be so powerful. He had killed 4 Heaven's Pride experts, not 4 ants. The death of a Heaven's Pride expert was a big thing. And he had killed 4. One could well imagine the tyranny of Emperor Chen's strength. The complexions of the Xianyuan twin stars somewhat changed. They were already quite wary of Emperor Chen. However, they couldn't help but gasp for breath when they heard this. Everyone suddenly understood. It was no longer surprising why these arrogant and domineering Xianyuan twin stars didn't dare to underestimate Emperor Chen. They had no choice but to inquire about his strength in advance. 2 among those 4 Heaven's Pride level experts had launched a joint sneak attack on Emperor Chen. However, he killed the both of them. The all-knowing scholar read out even more surprising information on Emperor Chen this time. It had been a 2 against 1. However, Emperor Chen had still managed to get rid of them. Countless people went in shock after they heard this information. It wasn't difficult for a Heaven's Pride expert to deal with another Heaven's Pride experts in a 1 versus 1 situation. After all, some of these Heaven's Pride experts were stronger than the others. So, it was completely understandable if he had defeated 2 experts who were weaker than himself. All kinds of unexpected things happen in a so-called fight between experts. One must make good use of every moment in a fight. A mere move might make a huge difference, and can create a disparity of cloud and mud. So, killing 4 individuals wouldn't have been a big thing. However, the situation would be completely different if it were to be 2 against 1, and that 2 in an ambush. Such an incident clearly meant that Emperor Chen possessed more strength than most of Heaven's Pride experts of this generation. This information had left everyone to gasp in admiration. The troubled complexions of the twin star brothers had turned ashen when they had heard this information. Wasn't this like a slap in the face of these 2? The news about these 2 brothers fighting as a tag team was well known in the entire world. The prospect of facing these 2 at once was akin to courting death for an ordinary Heaven's Pride expert. However, 2 Heaven's Pride experts had ambushed Emperor Chen in unison, and he had still managed to kill them. This information had made these brothers extremely afraid. Twin Stars brothers' biggest advantage was the fact that they fought as a tag team. Both of them were qualified enough to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert in their own individual merit. So, these 2 individuals working as a team should be considered as invincible as far as the younger generation was concerned. However, Emperor Chen had single-handedly achieved the same feat that these 2 individuals had notched as a team. This realization had to make them vigilant against him. Several experts went in shock as the all-knowing scholar read out that information. They had also become alert. After all, such a powerful expert was participating in this competition. He was a Heaven's Pride expert, like many others, but the gap between him and the others would slowly widen with time, to the extent that he might grow into a super expert who shakes the entire true martial world one day. Meanwhile, the rest of them would only climb up to the Great Sage realm. However, the difference between him and them would be like the gap between heaven and earth. However, that was a matter of the future. Even the Legendris realm and Semi-Sage realm were good enough for many people at present. After all, they had just set foot on the right track of martial arts practice. But such a big gap had appeared between him and them straight after they had entered the right track, and that too within such a short period of time. Who would be able to restrain him in the future? This was also the main reason why every big force wanted to strangle the top geniuses of the other forces in the cradle. The main reason for such plots was the emergence of experts like Emperor Chen. One might not be able to sense any danger from such experts in the initial days. However, everyone would see the sheer price they would have to pay for allowing such an expert to mature fully once they had grown up. And then, they would have to live in the shadow of such experts for thousands of years. History proves that 10,000 mediocre experts can't play the great role played by a true genius. But The ashen complexions of the Xianyuan twin stars didn't last long, and restored to the normal arrogant appearance as they spoke up, "Humph. A team of ordinary experts can't be compared to our team." These twin brothers had excellent coordination and mutual understanding. So, their tag team obviously couldn't be compared with the collaboration of two ordinary Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, two Heaven's Pride experts would be a burden on each other if they didn't have mutual understanding. And they wouldn't be able to display their maximum power. However, they had no choice but to admit the fact that Emperor Chen was indeed a formidable opponent. "I wish to know the information on Yi Shiwen. Do you have it?" A deep and coarse voice came through the gate at this time. Everyone was surprised to see a tall figure. He was approximately 10 feet tall. He looked like a young giant-like barbarian as he came striding in. He carried an imposing aura on his body. In fact, his aura was so compelling that it kept the other people away from him. He looked like the slumbering king of the beasts. "Qitian. He's Fire Cloud Cave's Qitian. Why has he arrived here?" He must have heard that the all-knowing scholar has arrived here. That's why he rushed over. However, why is he asking for information on Yi Shiwen? What kind of enmity do these two men have? God knows. The matters of these Heaven's Pride experts are very complicated. Moreover, these Heaven's Pride experts are quite strange. Only God knows of their reasons. "Brother Yi, this Qi Tian should be a good opponent for you." Qi Fifan frowned and spoke up. His body is extremely tough. He was ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert owing to his body. He possesses unfathomable strength and follows the same path as you. Yi Shiwen nodded. He wouldn't be anxious if it were an expert like Pang Yongbo. However, an expert like Qi Tian could be very difficult to handle. Yi Shiwen himself possessed the same kind of intrepid body. So, he obviously knew how ferocious such an expert could be. Such experts could cause exceptionally awful injuries if they got the opportunity to come close to one's body. Moreover, Yi Shiwen's realm was still beneath his by 2 levels. This was Yi Shiwen's weak point. 1000, Primary Spirit Dawn. The all-knowing scholar replied without looking up. Qi Tian's robust body was in front of him. However, it didn't have any effect on him. It seemed as if Qi Tian's beastly aura hadn't caused any impact on him. "I want all the information." Qi Tian threw a sack full of Primary Spirit Dawn towards the all-knowing scholar and said. Yi Shiwen took a sip of wine. The corners of his mouth slightly shook. He didn't know how all-knowing scholar would evaluate him. He wasn't clear how much this all-knowing scholar organization knew about him. But they might have gone to the depths of his matters and may possess all the information. Yi Shiwen was very afraid of this all-pervasive organization. Yi Shiwen was born in the Yiyuan school. It is located in the Great Yu State of Southeastern region. This school is situated in the lap of the Qingfeng Mountain. He used to be an ordinary disciple 10 years ago. Yi Shiwen's history was gradually dug out from the mouth of the all-knowing scholar. This caused a huge sensation among countless listeners. They become even more surprised as compared to when they had heard about Emperor Chen. They were surprised because Yi Shiwen was merely at the 3rd stage of the Hotian realm 10 years ago as per the information the all-knowing scholar was giving out. And everyone had been completely taken aback by this. They knew that Yi Shiwen's growth speed had always been very quick from the beginning, but they figured that it was only expected of a Heaven's Pride expert. However, they realized that he had witnessed a skyrocketing rise after as they listened to the all-knowing scholar's information. Most Heaven's Pride experts had already entered the truth realm 10 years, at the very least. This obviously excluded that little rascal Pang Yongbo. He was young, and had started late like Emperor Chen. However, he had entered the truth realm 10 years ago even so. However, Yi Shiwen used to be a mere expert of the Hotian realm at that time. Hotian realm was a long-gone history for all the experts here. They had long forgotten about this realm. It was a several decades old matter, or might be several hundred years old matter for some. Even the most nitpicking individual here had no choice but to admit that Yi Shiwen's progress speed was exceptionally quick. Yi Shiwen was different from a top genius like Pang Yongbo who had become a center of attraction since childhood. There had been no difference between Yi Shiwen and an average person 10 years ago. So, he had surely risen so sharply because of some fortuitous adventure. However, what kind of a fortuitous adventure must that have been? You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.